Imagine waking up in March of 1888 as one of the townsfolk along the northeastern coast of America. You open your eyes to a dim grey light seeping through the cracks of your shuttered windows. At first it seems like any late winter storm, but when you step outside, the world has vanished beneath walls of snow. The wind howls like a living beast, tearing at your coat, and the air itself feels sharp enough to cut your skin. This isn't just a storm, it's a white hurricane, a blizzard so fierce it will trap trains, bury homes, and turn ordinary streets into frozen tombs. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. Alright, find that cozy spot, take a nice slow breath, and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. We're stepping back into the time of the Great Blizzard of 1888, when snowdrifts rose higher than rooftops, and the simple act of fetching water could mean risking your life. No electricity, no central heating, no plows to clear the endless mounds of snow. And yet, families endured, clinging to flickering lanterns and each other's warmth while outside. The storm raged like a beast determined to swallow the world whole. Be grateful for the hum of your heater, the glow of your lights, and the fact that you don't have to dig a tunnel just to reach your front door. You wake to the sound of a horse's hooves striking the cobblestones outside, steady and familiar, the kind of rhythm that tells you the world is still moving the way it always has. It's the second week of March, 1888, and the morning feels ordinary. The air in your room is cold, but not unbearable. You can see your breath as a faint mist above the quilt, but you've known harsher mornings. Outside the window, the sky hangs pale and washed with a thin sheet of grey, but nothing that suggests danger. Just another late winter day in the northeastern states. You stretch your arms beneath the quilt, reluctant to leave the cocoon of warmth. The fire in the stove below has likely burned down to embers. Soon you'll rise, pile wood on the coals, and set the kettle to boil. There are errands to run, letters to send, and chores that cannot wait. Shops will open, ferries will cross, and the trains will whistle their way along the rails. People move through their routines without knowing that soon all of it will stop. The streets outside are busy with wagons, vendors calling out to early customers, and boys running errands with baskets swinging from their arms. The milkman lifts his cans with the strength of habit, pouring into glass bottles before moving to the next door. Women pause at stoops to sweep away yesterday's slush, shaking their heads at the mud it leaves behind. The hum of life is everywhere, the kind of bustle that makes a city feel alive in its bones. Some glance up at the sky, uneasy. The air carries a dampness, and the wind shifts in ways it hasn't for weeks. Fishermen on the coast speak of strange waves, of clouds building farther out to sea. Farmers inland note the way the air presses heavy, as if waiting. Still, no one lingers on it too long. Winter storms are common, and by March most are impatient for spring. Snowfall this late is a nuisance, nothing more, and life goes on with the stubborn determination that keeps people from fearing the sky. By afternoon, you find yourself walking along a crowded street, wrapped in a coat against the chill. You pass a newsstand where headlines warn of another snow, but the type is small, tucked beneath stories of politics and trade. The vendor shrugs as he folds papers, telling anyone who asks that storms come and go. A little more coal, a little more bread in the pantry, and everything will be fine. There is no alarm, no frantic rush. The city breathes steady, unknowing. Evening draws near. Lamps flicker to life, their glow warm against the encroaching dusk. Smoke drifts upward from chimneys, curling into the low clouds. Families gather around tables for supper, steam rising from pots of stew, bread breaking in hands tired from the day. The wind has picked up slightly now, rattling shutters and whistling faintly down alleys. You notice it as you climb into bed, quilt drawn high, the faint thought that perhaps tomorrow will be colder. But for now, it is calm. The last calm before the storm. You close your eyes, unknowing that in hours the sky will turn against you. By morning, snow will not be a dusting but a wall, and the world you know, the horses, the trains, the bustling streets will be buried in silence. Morning light returns muted, as though the sun itself has grown weary. You stir beneath your quilt, listening to the faint groan of the wind against the window panes. It is not a violent sound, not yet, but there is something in its voice that unsettles you. Outside, the sky is darker than it should be, clouds hanging low and heavy, as though they are crouching close to the earth, waiting to drop their weight. The air feels different too, thicker, damp, pressing against your lungs as you step outside. It carries with it the taste of iron, like the storm is already breathing down your neck. On the street, conversations drift in fragments. A woman remarks that her laundry, hung early on the line, froze stiff within minutes. A grocer mutters about the difficulty of keeping his produce from spoiling in this damp chill. A dock worker spits into the snow and curses the river, saying the current moves strangely too sluggish for the season. These are not official warnings, no proclamations from City Hall or bold headlines in the paper, just whispers. The kind of murmurs that ripple quietly between neighbors who have learned to read the moods of sky and soil better than any scientist's instruments. In the countryside, farmers watch their livestock with wary eyes. Cows shift restlessly, stamping hooves into the cold ground. Chickens huddle close, feathers fluffed wide, as though bracing for something greater than another passing snow. Shepherds notice their flocks grow uneasy when the clouds roll overhead, bleating as if they sense a shadow larger than themselves. The animals know what the people do not fully understand yet. Something enormous is coming. Along the coast, fishermen hesitate at their boats. Nets hang untouched, sails remain furled. They speak of the sea's strange behavior, waves rising without wind, swells that crash against the docks in erratic rhythm. The horizon, usually clear enough to give a man time to prepare, now seems swallowed in haze. It smells like a gale, one says, tightening his coat, but not like any I've known. Another shakes his head and refuses to leave shore, muttering about storms that strike without warning. Their caution sounds like superstition to some, but their voices carry the weight of experience carved by years of listening to the ocean's moods. Meanwhile, the city presses forward in its usual hurry. Policemen patrol corners, streetcars rattle down tracks, and merchants sweep the stoops of their shops. Yet beneath the bustle, a tension hangs. People pause longer than usual when glancing skyward. They remark on the strange heaviness of the air, how the damp seems to cling to coats and hair. No one declares it outright, but all can feel it, the sense that the weather has turned watchful, like an eye fixed upon them. By evening, the whispers grow stronger. Newspapers finally note the possibility of severe conditions, though still buried behind articles of politics and finance. A neighbor advises you to fetch extra coal, just in case. Another insists on laying in bread and salt pork before shops grow thin. Still, it is all spoken softly, half as precaution, half as doubt. No one wishes to be seen as alarmist. As darkness folds over the town, you light your lamps and settle inside, but the unease lingers. The shutters creak more often now, and the sky holds no stars, only a thick blanket that swallows the moon whole. Somewhere, deep within that silence, the storm is gathering its breath. And though the world has not yet fallen into chaos, you can feel it pressing closer, like a whisper carried on the wind, warning of what waits in the hours ahead. The day begins with the hush of something new in the air, a silence too deep to ignore. When you push open the door, the world greets you not with sound, but with the sight of it, the first flakes, drifting down in lazy spirals. At first they are light, almost delicate, like feathers shaken loose from the sky. They land on your sleeve and vanish in an instant, a fleeting dampness that melts before you can study it. You smile faintly, thinking it nothing unusual. March snow is common enough. Yet something in the way the flakes keep falling, steady and unbroken, sets a faint unease in your chest. You go about your tasks, boots crunching on old snow packed hard from weeks before. Neighbors nod as they pass, faces half hidden behind scarves. Some comment on the weather with the casualness of habit. Another dusting, one man says, brushing his hat, won't last long, but others pause longer than usual, gazing at the thickening curtain overhead. Children stretch their tongues to catch the flakes, laughing at the cold tickle, while their mothers tug them inside, muttering that it feels too raw to linger. By mid-morning, the rhythm of the snowfall changes. What began as scattered flecks now gathers strength, filling the air with a density that makes the world beyond the next street corner look blurred and pale. The flakes grow larger, clumping together into wet clusters that land heavy on your coat. Roofs turn white in minutes, fences vanish in a rising layer of frost. The flakes no longer melt when they touch the ground, they stay, stacking themselves into the beginnings of a new world. The sound of hooves and wagon wheels dulls beneath the powder. Horses snort and shake their heads as snow mats their manes. Wheels creak, straining against the fresh drag of slush forming underfoot. Vendors who had set out early with carts of bread and apples now cover their goods in cloth and quicken their pace, hoping to sell before the streets become impassable. A driver curses as his wagon skids, the horse slipping in the deepening layer, the first true hint that travel will soon be treacherous. Inside homes, fires are stoked higher. Children press their noses against the glass, marveling at the storm that seems to have no end. Parents share glances across tables, quietly measuring their supplies of coal and flour. For many, it still feels manageable, even cozy, the kind of snow that invites one to linger indoors with stews simmering and stories told by lamplight. But outside, the storm has no such gentle intent. The flakes thicken, twisting sideways as the wind sharpens. By afternoon, visibility shrinks to little more than an arm's reach. Gas lamps along the streets glow faint halos, swallowed by veils of white. Shouts carry strangely muffled and warped, as though the storm itself is swallowing voices whole. The flakes are no longer quiet companions but soldiers in an endless march, each one piling upon the last, determined to bury the world beneath their weight. And yet, as dusk approaches, the city still clings to normalcy. Shops remain open, though customers thin, ferries still attempt to cross, though slower, and trains still whistle down the rails, though already slowed by drifts. But as you close your shutters against the cold, you know this is not the end of the snow. This is only its beginning, the first flakes of a storm that will not stop until the world is remade in white. The snow has already begun its work, draping fences, chimneys, and rooftops in white. But now another force joins it. You hear it first as a low moan, sliding through cracks in the shutters. The wind rises slowly, like a giant drawing breath, and then releases it with sudden ferocity. The quiet flakes that fell gently in the morning are no longer gentle, they are whipped sideways, driven hard against walls and faces with the sting of tiny needles. Stepping outside, you feel it at once. The air no longer moves in soft currents but in sharp lashes that grab your coat and tug like invisible hands. Hats are snatched, skirts whipped about, scarves pulled loose from necks. The flakes don't fall, they charge, flung in waves across the streets, blurring outlines of homes and lampposts until all seems washed into one colorless blur. The storm has found its voice, and it is merciless. Along the docks, ropes strain against moorings, ships groaning as they rock against the ice-choked waters. The masts creak like old bones, sails snapping though they are tied down. Sailors curse as they fight to secure what they can, but the wind roars louder than their shouts, tearing words away before they reach another ear. On city streets, shopkeepers struggle to lower shutters against the force pressing inward. Doors slam, windows rattle, and every gap becomes a whistle, the storm insisting on entering wherever it can. Farmhouses out in the countryside tremble under the assault. Thin walls quiver, rafters creak, and smoke twists violently from chimneys only to be forced back down again, choking fires. Families scramble to seal drafts with cloth and boards, stuffing rags into gaps between sills and walls. Still, the wind finds its way, slipping under doors, sighing along floors, filling rooms with its icy breath. As daylight wanes, the blizzard grows bolder. Snow piles into drifts that shift like dunes, sculpted and reshaped with each furious gust. A path cleared minutes before vanishes, buried once more. Horses shy and rear, eyes rolling with fear, their strength no match for the gale. Wagons tip, barrels roll, and in some places entire sheds collapse beneath the weight of snow, aided by the relentless battering from above. Inside, you sit near the fire, the sound of the wind pressing against your ears as though the house itself is under siege. The walls groan with every blast, timbers answering with dull, anxious creaks. At times the sound mimics a human cry, high-pitched and wailing, as though unseen voices have joined the storm. You pull the quilt tighter around your shoulders, staring into the flames, trying not to listen to the relentless chorus beyond the walls. By nightfall, the wind has become a beast, howling through alleys and over rooftops, clawing at the city with unseen talons. Windows shiver in their frames, and shutters slam until hinges give way. Snow rushes into openings, filling corners and stairwells, claiming every gap left undefended. What had begun as a snowfall is no longer mere weather, it is an assault, a siege of air and ice. And as you close your eyes, sleep does not come easy. The storm's voice is everywhere, rattling, groaning, wailing through the night. You know that by morning, the world outside will no longer resemble the one you left behind. The wind has risen, and it will not rest until it has remade the land in its own image. The whistle of the locomotive begins as it always does, piercing, confident, a sound meant to cut through fog and snow alike. You hear it from afar as the train pushes forward along its steel rails, the heart of industry pounding strong against the storm. But today, that sound does not fade into distance as usual. Instead, it grows fainter, swallowed by the blizzard, until it is only a muffled cry beneath the roar of wind. The train has not conquered the storm has conquered the train. Inside the passenger cars, travelers sit huddled in their coats, windows frosted so thick that even pressing one's face to the glass reveals nothing but white. The wheels screech, fighting for grip, and then the forward lurch that once promised progress slows into a grinding crawl. Snow piles against the tracks in walls higher than the engine's wheels, drifts forming faster than any crew can shovel. Finally, with a groan of metal and a final hiss of steam, the locomotive shudders to a stop. The train is trapped in the white. At first, there is disbelief. Passengers murmur that it will start again in a moment, that the engine only needs to gather its strength. A businessman checks his pocket watch and mutters about meetings, certain the delay is temporary. Children peer through the frost, drawing shapes in the window fog, amused by the strangeness. But minutes pass, then an hour, and the train does not move. The furnace burns coal furiously, but the heat cannot fight the growing cold that seeps into the carriages. The conductor moves down the aisles, his face stern but calm. He tells the passengers to remain seated, that the crew is working to clear the track ahead. Men with shovels climb down into the storm, their figures vanishing within feet, swallowed whole by the white abyss. They dig furiously, but the snow drifts back faster than they can clear, the storm mocking their effort. The shouts of the men fade quickly, their forms only faint shadows flickering through a curtain of snow. Hours stretch long. The air grows colder as the coal begins to dwindle. Families wrap themselves tighter in blankets and coats, sharing body warmth. Mothers hush their offspring with whispered songs, while fathers glance uneasily at the shrinking coal piles in the furnace. The lanterns flicker low, their glow dim against the storm outside, and every creak of the wooden car echoes like a warning. Some passengers speak of walking to the nearest town, but the conductor shakes his head. "You won't last 10 minutes out there," he warns, his voice nearly drowned by the howl of the wind pressing against the carriages. The storm outside is not just snow, it is a wall, a moving prison. To step into it is to vanish. By nightfall, the train cars feel less like vessels of travel and more like coffins of iron and wood, stranded in a white desert with no path forward, no path back. Breath clouds in the air, and silence grows heavy, broken only by the shriek of the wind through cracks in the walls. The mighty engine that once carried hope and haste now sits helpless, buried in the storm's grip. The passengers close their eyes that night, not with the comfort of arrival ahead, but with the fear that perhaps there will be no arrival at all. The rails are gone, the path erased, and the blizzard reigns supreme. The trains, like the people, have halted in the white. All across the land, the thin iron veins of the telegraph hum with silence. What once carried words faster than horse or ship now falters beneath the storm's weight. You wake to the sound of it in the distance, the groan of poles swaying, the metallic twang of wires straining. In calmer days, the telegraph had become the nation's nervous system, carrying news, orders, and voices from one city to another. But the blizzard does not care for wires or systems. It tears them down as though they were nothing more than strands of cobweb in its grasp. Along the railway lines, poles topple like dominoes. The wind batters them without pause, each gust pulling harder until the wood snaps with a crack sharp as gunfire. Wires whip loose, sparking briefly in the night as they lash against one another, then vanish under mounds of snow. In city streets, they sag low over alleys, heavy with ice, drooping until they finally give way. The sound is eerie, a mix of snapping whips, tearing cloth, and the hollow crash of wood against stone. Telegraph offices, once bustling with the clatter of keys and the steady rhythm of dots and dashes, fall quiet. Operators sit at their desks, tapping out messages that go nowhere, the signals breaking into silence. Fingers hover above keys, waiting for a reply that never comes. The silence is more frightening than the storm's roar, for silence means the line is dead, the world beyond unreachable. News cannot come in, warnings cannot go out. The storm has severed the voice of the nation. In homes, people grow restless, waiting for word of loved ones stranded on trains or trapped in distant towns. Mothers who sent sons on errands to neighboring cities stand at windows, eyes on the wires outside, as if willing them to speak. Merchants wonder about shipments, about contracts frozen in limbo. Newspapers, starved of information, print what little they know, their presses slowing under the weight of rumor rather than fact. Without the telegraph, even the most powerful editors are reduced to guesswork. Outside, the wires themselves become hazards. In some streets they dangle low, coated in ice, swaying like serpents over the heads of passers-by. Horses rear at the sight of them, their hooves slipping on frozen cobblestones. In the countryside, fallen lines vanish into snowdrifts, invisible traps waiting for the unwary. Farmers stumble upon them while clearing paths, pulling the wires aside with numb hands, muttering curses as they disappear once more into the white. By nightfall, the absence of the telegraph is felt everywhere. The storm has not just buried roads and railways, it has buried communication itself. Cities feel smaller, isolated, as though the world has shrunk to the limits of what one can see from a window or hear from a neighbor's shout. Beyond that, there is nothing. No news, no reassurance, no promise that help is on its way. You sit by the fire, staring at the silent wires outside, swaying in the gale. Once they carried words across a continent in the blink of an eye. Now they are nothing but dark strings against a darker sky, broken instruments in a song of silence. The storm has cut the cord, leaving each town and village alone in its fight. In the blizzard's grip, even voices cannot travel. By the third day of snow, the city no longer resembles a city. Streets that once rang with the sound of hooves and wheels are gone, buried under mountains of white. You open your door and find not a road, not even a walkway, but a wall adrift higher than your shoulders, pressed firm against the frame like a barricade laid by nature itself. To move through the world now requires digging, carving, tunneling. The streets are no longer streets, they are passages underground, carved by desperate hands. Neighbors emerge one by one, shovels in hand, their faces wrapped in scarves stiff with frost. They chip and hack at the snow, lifting it in heavy blocks and piling it higher still until the open air feels like walking between canyon walls. Some tunnels rise higher than a man, narrow corridors with walls of packed white that lean inward, threatening to collapse at the next gust. Children slip through these narrow passageways like explorers, laughing despite the danger, while parents shout after them, fearful that the walls might shift and bury them whole. Gas lamps, once standing proud above the sidewalks, are now swallowed to their necks. Their glass globes glow faintly through the snow, ghostly orbs lighting the tunnels from within. Horses and wagons have long since vanished, hidden beneath drifts that stretch unbroken from doorstep to doorstep. A fence here, a chimney there, these are the only markers left above the snow's surface. The rest of the city lives beneath. Men dig paths to the baker's shop, to the butcher's door, to the nearest stable, forming a network of snowy corridors connecting house to house, block to block. Some tunnels are reinforced with boards scavenged from sheds, the timbers pressed against the walls like ribs, holding back the crushing weight. Others are left bare, treacherous channels that collapse without warning, sealing off routes and forcing the diggers to start again. Every footstep echoes strangely in these trenches, the sound absorbed by snow until even voices feel hushed, swallowed by the blizzard's grip. The tunnels bring neighbors closer in strange ways. Doors that once opened onto busy streets now open onto shared passageways, forcing families to greet one another daily. People exchange food, news, and worries in these narrow corridors, their lanterns casting long shadows against the white walls. Some carry hot bricks wrapped in cloth to keep fingers warm as they walk. Others pull sleds laden with coal or kindling. The tunnels are lifelines, but they are also reminders of captivity paths dug not out of freedom, but necessity. Above, the storm continues its assault. Wind screams across the rooftops, flinging more snow into the canyons below. Loose drifts cascade into the tunnels like waterfalls of powder, undoing hours of labor in moments. Shovels clang, hands blister, backs ache, but still the digging continues. Without the tunnels, there is no bread, no water, no chance of survival. By night, the tunnels glow faintly with scattered lanterns, a hidden city beneath the snow. Families walk hunched, bundled against the cold, their breath curling into mist that hangs in the narrow air. You trail your hand along the walls as you pass, the snow cold and solid beneath your palm, and you realize that the city has become a maze. Streets have turned to tunnels, and life itself has been buried. Darkness falls, though the storm makes it hard to tell when evening truly arrives. The sky has been grey for so long that daylight seems only a dimmer shade of night, but now the lamps burn faint behind frosted glass, and fires are stoked high against the pressing cold. The blizzard howls on, its voice rattling windows and forcing smoke back down chimneys, and you realize this night will not be like others. It will be longer, heavier, a weight that settles on the spirit as much as the body. The long night has begun. Inside the homes of the city and the countryside alike, families huddle near stoves. The glow of the fire paints faces in shades of gold and shadow, while beyond the walls, the wind claws at shingles and shutters, as if trying to pry its way in. Quilts are pulled tighter, every scrap of cloth piled onto laps and shoulders. Some lay hot bricks at their feet, others tuck warmed stones into bedclothes, anything to stretch what little coal or wood remains. The air tastes of smoke and damp wool, heavy with the unshakable sense of being sealed inside. The storm outside is a ceaseless drumbeat, and its fury leaks into the house through every crack. Doors groan, rafters moan, and sometimes the sound resembles a voice, high-pitched wails that twist through the wind, like cries carried from far off in the storm. Children stir uneasily at the noise, whispering questions their parents cannot answer. Mothers hush them, stroking their hair, while fathers stare into the flames, their silence heavy with worry. In the city, the tunnels dug earlier in the day are abandoned to darkness. No lanterns swing now in those white corridors, for the wind has turned them into traps. Snow collapses into the paths without warning, burying them in silence. Those who ventured too late risked never returning, swallowed by the night. Now, all is still outside, save for the roar of the storm. Whole streets vanish from memory, hidden beneath drifts as high as rooftops. The trains sit frozen in place, their passengers huddled against one another for warmth. Lanterns gutter, coal dwindles, and the air inside grows sharp with cold. Stories are whispered to pass the hours, tales of past storms survived, of summers so hot one could barely breathe. But as the storm batters the cars, even these tales feel hollow. Men wrap their coats tighter around their families and pray quietly that morning will bring relief. In the countryside, isolation is even sharper. Cabins buried to their windows glow faintly with lamplight, tiny islands in an ocean of white. The sound of the storm is louder here, unbroken by buildings, and the night feels endless. Livestock huddle in barns where the walls rattle, hay piled thick to keep them alive until dawn. Some farmers pace floors, counting logs left in the stack, knowing the fire must not be allowed to die. Midnight comes, though no one marks it. Time drifts in strange ways when there is no difference between night and day, only storm and silence. Families lie awake under quilts, listening to the world groan under the weight of snow. Every creak feels like a warning, every gust like the hand of some great force pressing harder. Sleep comes only in brief moments, broken by the roar of wind. And so the long night stretches on, a night where the storm rules, where fire is fragile, and where every breath is a reminder that the blizzard has only just begun to show its strength. The morning brings no relief, only deeper silence muffled beneath mountains of snow. You push open the door, carving a narrow gap just wide enough to peer outside, and the sight that greets you is a world erased. Fences, wagons, and even entire shops lie hidden, swallowed by drifts that rise like frozen seas. And within that sea, struggling shapes move, horses trapped chest deep in the snow, their breath rising in pale clouds that hang like ghosts. These animals, so long the lifeblood of the city and countryside alike, are now helpless in the blizzard's grip. Their hooves thrash weakly, but every step sinks them deeper. The snow swallows their legs, the wind blinds their eyes, and the cold bites into their hides despite the thickness of their coats. Some stand rigid, sides heaving with exhaustion, eyes wide with the panic of creatures that know they are prey not to wolves, but to weather itself. In the city, dray horses that once pulled carts of coal or barrels of milk now stand abandoned in the streets, their harnesses frozen stiff, their bodies glazed with ice. Drivers who tried to force them forward found the task hopeless. Wheels lock in the snow, hooves slip on hidden ice, and the storm drowns every shouted command. Many unharness their teams and lead them to shelter, but even that path becomes impossible once the drifts rise taller than man or beast. Some horses collapse where they stand, their breath steaming until at last it ceases. Snow gathers on their still forms, covering them as if the blizzard itself were quick to bury the evidence of its cruelty. On farms, it is no better. Stable doors are buried under tons of snow, and farmers dig desperately with shovels and bare hands to reach the animals inside. When at last they break through, the air within is thick with steam, the horses huddled together in a press of bodies for warmth. Their eyes roll white, their ears twitch, their flanks shiver with effort. Farmers carry in armfuls of hay, but the feed dwindles quickly, and the storm shows no sign of passing. Water buckets freeze into solid blocks of ice, and some resort to melting snow by the hearth, ladling it into troughs while their fingers grow raw from the cold. The sound of the animals is heartbreaking. Whinnies rise into the storm, high-pitched and trembling, sometimes answered by distant echoes from other barns, other streets, other teams, equally trapped. The storm muffles most of it, yet those who listen closely swear they can hear the voices of horses carried through the blizzard, a chorus of desperation threaded through the wind's roar. By nightfall, the drifts have claimed more. Frozen bodies lie half buried at crossroads, harness straps still buckled, traces of struggle etched in the snow around them. Children peek from windows and are pulled back quickly by parents who whisper prayers and close the shutters fast. To see a horse fallen is to see the storm's power laid bare, for if even these strong creatures cannot stand against it, what chance do men and women have? Inside you sit by the fire, the sound of hooves and whinnies still echoing faintly in your ears. The horses in the drifts are not just beasts of burden, they are companions, lifelines, the very muscle of survival. And now, one by one, they are sinking, vanishing into the blizzard's endless white, leaving the world quieter, lonelier, and far more fragile. Night falls again, though the storm makes every hour feel like twilight. The world outside is a blur of snow and wind, an endless white that devours distance, shape, and sound. And yet, through that chaos, faint lights move, small, trembling flames carried by human hands. Lanterns in the white, flickering beacons of life against a storm that wants only silence. The rescuers emerge from doorways and tunnels carved into the drifts, their faces wrapped in scarves, their shoulders bent against the gale. Each man or woman carries a lantern, its glass fogged with frost, the flame inside straining as if it too fears the storm. They move slowly, carefully, for the snow beneath them shifts without warning, and the wind claws at their arms, threatening to wrench the light away. The glow of a lantern is pitifully small against the storm, but to those lost in the white, it is everything. Passengers stranded in train cars press their faces to iced windows, hoping to glimpse a faint glimmer in the distance. Families trapped in buried homes peer through cracks in shutters, praying for the glow of rescue to pierce the night. For many, the sight of a lantern swaying through the blizzard is not just light, it is salvation. The storm makes cruel sport of these flames. Gusts slam hard, rattling the glass, dimming the light to a trembling ember. Snow clings to the lanterns, coating them in white until they appear as glowing orbs wandering through a sea of ice. Sometimes the wind wins. A flame dies, and its bearer curses, crouching to shield it, fumbling with matches in hands too stiff to strike. Others huddle together, holding lanterns close, creating small clusters of light in the vast dark. From a distance, the sight is eerie. Tiny points of gold float in the storm, drifting like willow the wisps between the towering drifts. They move in silence, footsteps muffled, voices swallowed by the roar. It is as though the blizzard has reduced humanity to scattered sparks, fragile against a void too large to fight. Some lanterns guide rescue sleds pulled by weary horses, their sides heaving, their hooves plunging into snow that rises nearly to their bellies. Others light the path for men digging with shovels, clearing tunnels toward trapped neighbors. Still others serve no task but hope carried by men who wander into the storm searching for lost kin, holding the light aloft as though it might call the missing back home. In the countryside, lanterns swing from barns and cabin doors, their flames faint but steady, a signal to anyone stumbling through the white that shelter lies within. Farmers check their animals by lantern light, brushing snow from their coats, whispering softly, though the animals shiver too much to be calmed. The glow illuminates frost on their whiskers, breath rising in clouds that sparkle briefly before vanishing into the night. By midnight the storm still rages, yet the lanterns endure. They sway, they flicker, they sputter, but they do not vanish. Each one is a defiance, a fragile refusal to surrender to the dark. And as you sit by the fire, you imagine those faint flames moving through the storm, small golden hearts beating in the vast white silence, proof that even in the fiercest blizzard, humanity will carry its light forward, no matter how fragile the flame. The storm does not spare iron or steam. Out along the buried tracks, locomotives sit like stranded beasts, their mighty wheels sunken into drifts that rise higher than the pistons. The once proud hiss of steam has grown faint, choked by the cold. You can almost hear the sigh of the engines as their breath fades, boilers straining against dwindling coal, metal frames groaning under the bite of ice. These are not trains in motion anymore. They are monuments to stillness, frozen on the rails. Inside the cars, passengers cling to what warmth remains. The first hours of waiting were filled with talk assurances that the line would be cleared, that another train would come, that the storm could not last. But as night fell and the wind rose, the cheer vanished. The windows grew opaque with frost, glass crusted in lace-like patterns that no hand could scrape away. Beyond them there is nothing but white, a blindness that swallows the world. The iron stoves in each car burn through their coal too quickly. At first they give off steady heat, comforting against the draft that slips through cracks in the wood. But the supply dwindles, and soon the fire is rationed. The flames shrink, the glow weakens, and the air inside grows colder with each passing hour. Breath curls into mist above every mouth. People stamp their feet, rub their hands together, wrap scarves higher over their faces, but still the chill creeps in, relentless and patient. Children whimper and press close to their mothers, who rock them softly, whispering songs drowned by the storm's roar outside. Older men shift uneasily, watching the coal bin with anxious eyes. A few try to make light of the situation, telling stories of other storms survived, but their voices tremble, and the laughter they seek does not come. Hunger sets in next. Lunch baskets empty quickly, and soon only crumbs remain. Some passengers chew at crusts gone stiff with cold, others share an apple passed carefully from hand to hand. Crew members move along the aisles, checking lanterns, urging calm. Their boots crunch against a thin layer of frost forming on the floorboards, a cruel reminder that the inside of the car is no safer than the night beyond. They speak of sending men to walk the tracks for help, but each time the door opens, the storm howls through with such fury that the thought of stepping outside seems suicidal. The wind blasts snow inside in great gusts, extinguishing lanterns, numbing hands instantly. Those who ventured out earlier have not returned. By midnight, silence has settled, conversation dwindles to whispers, then to nothing at all. The only sounds are the groans of the train as it shifts under the pressure of snow, the creak of wood contracting in the cold, and the low sobs of the weary. Some passengers close their eyes, though sleep does not come easily. They dream of warm beds, of hearth fires, of streets alive with light and sound. But when they wake, the same frozen prison surrounds them. Outside, the storm rages on, piling more snow across the buried rails, sealing the train tighter in its icy tomb. The passengers are no longer travelers. They are captives of the blizzard, their fate bound not to timetables or destinations, but to whether the fire lasts one more hour, whether help arrives before the storm claims them. Frozen on the rails, they wait, each breath a cloud in the cold, each minute another thread of hope unraveling in the endless white. When the storm first struck, the market still carried their promise of abundance. Stalls brimmed with barrels of apples, crates of onions, and loaves stacked high on shelves. But as the snow deepened and the wind hardened into a wall of white, those supplies began to vanish, piece by piece, until the markets themselves stood hollow, their tables bare and their doors locked against the cold. The market empties, and with it, a city's sense of security fades. You rise in the morning with hunger gnawing faintly at your stomach. Bread had been rationed the night before, one crust per person, softened in broth to make it last. Today you wrap yourself against the cold and venture out, following the narrow tunnel carved between snowdrifts, a passage dug by neighbors with shovels and stubborn hope. Lanterns hang at intervals, their flames dim under a sheen of ice, guiding you through the labyrinth to the nearest square where the market stands. When you arrive, the sight is haunting. The stalls that once spilled with color now sit stripped, only empty crates and overturned barrels remaining. Merchants huddle in doorways with frozen breath, shaking their heads to those who approach. "No more," they say, their voices muffled through scarves. Flour sacks are gone, butter and eggs long sold, milk frozen in pails before it could be delivered. Meat is scarce too, what little available bought at prices so high that few can afford it. Coins clink useless in pockets, there is nothing left to buy. In the city, whispers carry through the tunnels. Families boiling thin soups from scraps, stretching a potato across 3 meals, dipping bread crusts into melted snow. Children cry from hunger, their voices thin as the wind outside. Neighbors share what they can, but generosity grows strained when larder's empty. One woman hands out the last of her dried beans, weeping as she does so, while another guards her basket fiercely, unwilling to part with even a crust. Hunger changes faces, softening some, hardening others. The countryside fares no better. Farm roads are impassable, barns buried, animals weakening with every passing day. Wagons of grain that might have fed the cities sit stranded on country lanes, snow packed to their axles. Farmers look upon their dwindling stores with grim faces, knowing they must choose between feeding their families or their livestock. The storm has made the strongest resource of all food into a memory fading fast. By afternoon, the markets resemble ghostly halls. Doors creak in the wind, shutters slam, and snow gathers in the corners where goods once changed hands. People still come, clutching baskets, hoping for a miracle delivery, a late cart, a ship that somehow broke through the frozen river. But each time they return home with baskets as empty as when they left. That night, kitchens are quiet. Pots simmer, not with meat or bread, but with melted snow, flavored faintly with whatever scraps remain. Onion skins, carrot tops, the last pinch of salt. Families eat slowly, trying to trick their stomachs with thin broth and whispered reassurances. The market has emptied, and the storm shows no mercy. Hunger has joined the wind and snow, another relentless force pressing down upon the world. At dawn, when the storm still howled and snow rose higher than doorframes, the milkman rose from his bed. For years his work had been steady, a rhythm as certain as the sun's rise. Cans filled at the dairy, bottles clinking in his cart, the sound of hooves striking cobblestones as he moved from house to house. Families trusted him. Children waited at windows for the familiar knock, eager for the day's milk. But now, in the grip of the blizzard, that duty had become nearly impossible. Still, he tried. The milkman's burden was heavier than ever before. He pulls on boots stiff with frost, wraps his scarf high, and shoulders the yoke bearing 2 heavy cans of milk. The horse that once pulled his cart cannot leave the barn. Drifts bury the wheels to their hubs. So he walks, each step sinking deep into snow that swallows his legs to the knees. His breath clouds in the dim light, freezing against his beard, while the wind claws at the lids of the cans, rattling them as if the storm itself wants to steal what little nourishment he carries. Through narrow tunnels dug between the drifts, he trudges on. Lanterns left by neighbors glow faintly, guiding his path. But their light is swallowed quickly by the storm. Children peer from doorways as he passes, their eyes wide, their mothers calling them back inside. At each stop he knocks, shoulders bowed, and pours what he can into bottles or tin cups. Some families still have coins to pay, pressing them into his hand with fingers trembling from cold. Others offer nothing but gratitude, whispering blessings as he moves on. He does not refuse. He cannot. The storm may strip the world bare, but the milk must still be delivered. The burden grows heavier with each block. Snow slips into his boots, numbing his toes while the wind lashes his face raw. The cans clank dully, half empty now, the sound hollow against the blizzard's roar. At times he stumbles, dropping to one knee, milk sloshing dangerously near the brim. He rights himself with a groan, shoulders straining, knowing that every drop lost is a drop a child will not drink. In some places he finds only silence. Doors remain shut, no answer to his knock. Families too cold or too sick to rise lie wrapped in quilts, listening for him but unable to move. He leaves bottles anyway, setting them in snowbanks by the stoop, hoping they will be found before the storm freezes them solid. By afternoon, his pace slows. The streets are endless trenches, the wind relentless. He stops often, resting against snow walls, his breath ragged, his body aching. Yet he rises again, for he knows that mothers wait behind shuttered windows, listening for his knock, praying for the sound of milk pouring into a cup. When at last he returns to his own door, the cans are empty, his hands raw, his boots soaked through. He has nothing left to give, but he has carried out his burden, step by frozen step. And though the storm rages on, though hunger still lingers in every home, for one more day the milkman has delivered hope in glass and tin. The blizzard has not broken him, not yet. The blizzard has stolen sound. Where once the city thrummed with the noise of iron wheels and hammer strikes, the clip-clop of hooves, the calls of vendors hawking wares, now there is only hush. The storm has buried the voice of the city as thoroughly as it has buried its streets. A city that never truly slept lies now in eerie stillness. Every corner smothered in snow, every sound muffled until even footsteps vanish into silence. You rise in the dim morning, straining to hear what you expect, the whistle of the ferry on the river, the clang of a trolley bell, the rumble of carts carrying coal, but nothing comes. The air itself feels thick, as though holding its breath. When you press your ear to the window, all you hear is the low roar of wind in the distance, more like a memory than a presence. It is silence of a strange sort, not peace, but absence, as though the city has been hollowed out. The tunnels dug through drifts remain, narrow canyons of white where people shuffle from door to door. Yet even here, voices are low, conversations whispered. Neighbors pass without greeting, heads bent, eyes fixed on the snow underfoot. To speak aloud feels wrong, as though the storm itself might hear and punish. Even the bark of a dog, once sharp and insistent, is reduced to a muffled whine that fades quickly into the blanket of white. Church bells, once the heartbeat of the city, hang frozen in their steeples, ropes stiff with ice. They do not toll the hours or call the faithful to prayer. The silence of the bells weighs heavily, for their absence reminds all who listen that even the most steadfast rhythms of life have been broken. Streetcars stand locked in snow, their tracks invisible, their bells muted. Horses lie still beneath drifts, their voices gone, their once lively snorts no longer echoing through the alleys. Inside, the silence presses close. Families sit around stoves, voices hushed, their movements soft, as if unwilling to disturb the heavy quiet. The crackle of firewood sounds unnaturally loud, each pop startling in the hush. Children whisper questions, mothers hush them quickly, and fathers sit staring at windows rimmed in ice, their thoughts swallowed by the stillness. Even the tick of a clock seems like defiance, the only steady rhythm left against the city's silence. At night, the quiet deepens into something uncanny. No wheels rattle, no ferries call from the river, no laughter drifts from taverns. The city lies beneath a frozen shroud, a place of lantern-lit tunnels and shuttered windows. To look outside is to see nothing move, nothing stir, save the endless snow twisting in the gale. It is a silence that gnaws at the mind, for people are not made for such stillness. They long for noise, for bustle, for the proof that life continues beyond their walls. Yet the silence endures, heavy and unbroken. The storm has taken sound as surely as it has taken sight, leaving behind a city that feels less like a place of the living and more like a frozen dream, paused in time. A city gone silent, waiting for the thaw that will someday return its voice. When the storm finally pauses long enough for people to push open their doors, they find not streets, not paths, not even yards, only walls. Snowdrifts higher than men, taller than door frames, rise like frozen fortresses across the city. They block alleys, swallow fences, and bury whole wagons until only the curve of a wheel or the edge of a shaft peeks through. What was once open ground is now a maze of gleaming barricades, sculpted by the wind into shapes both beautiful and cruel. You step outside into one of these canyons, boots sinking deep into the powder. The walls of snow tower on either side, pressed tight and solid as stone, their tops catching the dim winter light. In some places, the drifts rise above second-story windows, forcing families to climb through attics just to see the sky. Rooftops become doorsteps, ladders become streets, and the familiar shape of the city is erased under these monstrous heaps. Men take up shovels, their shoulders already weary, and begin to dig. They carve passageways into the drifts, the scrape of iron on packed snow echoing faintly through the still air. Each shovelful feels hopeless, for as soon as a path is cleared, the wind fills it again. Yet they persist, sweat freezing on their brows, because to stop means to remain trapped. In some places, the drifts lean dangerously inward, threatening collapse. To walk between them is to move through a cathedral of ice, its white arches fragile and shifting with every gust. Children gaze in awe at the towering walls, their small hands brushing the icy surfaces. To them, the drifts are mountains, places to climb and slide, their laughter briefly piercing the hush. But their parents call them back quickly, fearful of slides and sudden falls. The snow is not playful. It is heavy, unyielding, capable of suffocating the unwary in a breathless silence. Already, stories spread of those who vanished beneath collapsing heaps, their cries muffled before help could reach them. The scale of it unsettles even the most seasoned. Horses disappear into hollows, their ears barely visible above the surface. Wagons lie buried so deep that entire teams of men labor to uncover them. Telegraph poles rise from the drifts like broken sticks, their wires trailing uselessly, half frozen in the ice. The city's edges are unrecognizable, fields turned into white deserts, rivers sealed beneath jagged piles of snow that glint like shards of glass. Inside the tunnels dug between these towering drifts, life carries on in shadows. Lanterns glow faintly against the icy walls, turning the snow golden in places, blue in others. Neighbors pass quietly, their voices hushed, their steps careful. It feels as though they are walking underground, in a city that has been buried alive. As night falls, the drifts loom even larger, their tops vanishing into darkness, their sides catching the lantern light in eerie glimmers. The sheer weight of them presses on the spirit, a reminder that nature has built its own prison, and every man and woman is trapped within. Snowdrifts higher than men, monuments to the storm's power, stand as silent walls that will not fall until the sun returns to tear them down. By the fourth day, the storm's grip tightens not only on streets and trains, but on the very homes meant to offer safety. In the countryside, cabins lie smothered beneath drifts, so high that windows vanish, doors refuse to open, and chimneys barely poke above the endless white. Families wake to darkness, not because night lingers, but because the snow has sealed every crack, every pane, every way that light might enter. It is as if the cabins themselves have been swallowed, their inhabitants buried alive. Inside, the air grows close and heavy. Fires burn low, their smoke struggling to rise through chimneys clogged with snow and ice. Sometimes the smoke is forced back down, filling the room with a bitter haze that stings the eyes and chokes the lungs. Fathers climb onto rafters with shovels in hand, pushing desperately upward through attic windows, carving narrow shafts just to let the smoke escape. Mothers wrap quilts around the youngest, pressing cloth against their faces when the air thickens too much to breathe. Every door is useless, pressed tight by the weight of snow piled higher than a man's shoulders. To leave the cabin requires tunneling, digging not outward, but upward, clawing a path toward daylight. The sound of shovels striking packed drifts echoes like muffled drumbeats, though often the storm's roar swallows even that. Some succeed in breaking through, emerging onto a strange new world where only rooftops mark the places of homes. Others fail, their tunnels collapsing before they reach the open air, forcing them back into the dim glow of the hearth. Food runs thin in these buried homes. Pantries shrink quickly when no wagon can reach the door, when no market can be walked to without risking suffocation in the storm. Dried beans are boiled into thin soups, potatoes rationed into slivers, flour stretched into flat cakes baked on the hearth. Snow is melted for water, poured into kettles blackened with soot, its taste flat and metallic but still precious. Hunger gnaws quietly at every stomach, while the sound of the wind above reminds them that no help is coming soon. The silence of entrapment weighs heavily. Children ask why the windows no longer glow, why the outside has disappeared. Parents answer softly, telling them it is only a passing storm. Though their own faces betray the truth, they know that storms do not usually bury homes whole. At night, the weight of the snow presses down in more than sound. The timbers groan, rafters creak, walls lean inward as though bowing to the pressure. Families lie awake under quilts, listening, wondering if the roof will hold until dawn. In some places, neighbors tunnel from cabin to cabin, carving passageways like veins through the snow. Lanterns glow faintly in these white corridors, casting flickering shadows along walls that glisten like crystal. Voices echo strangely, distant yet near, a reminder that though each family is trapped, they are not alone in their entombment. Still, the sense of burial persists. Every breath, every word, every prayer is muffled beneath tons of snow, the storm's heavy shroud pressing down from above. Buried alive in cabins, they wait, hearts pounding with each creak of wood, each sigh of the wind, knowing that survival depends not only on fire and food, but on whether the weight of winter itself spares the roof above their heads. The city, once a place of open avenues and crowded squares, has become a maze of narrow trenches. Snowdrifts tower above head height, cutting off sight of the world beyond your block. To reach a neighbor's door, to fetch a loaf of bread, or share a scuttle of coal, people must carve their way through the frozen walls. And so, a strange new landscape emerges. Tunnels between houses, dug not for convenience, but for survival. You step into one of these corridors, shoulders brushing the icy sides, lantern held high to push back the gloom. The air inside is muffled, a silence broken only by the scrape of shovel blades and the crunch of boots. The snow walls gleam faintly, their packed surfaces catching the lantern light in shades of blue and gold. Overhead, the sky is a narrow slit, often hidden entirely where the drift has risen so tall that men must dig covered passageways, roofs of snow arching above like frozen ceilings. The tunnels connect house to house, block to block, forming a hidden network beneath the blizzard's grip. In some places, families prop the walls with boards salvaged from sheds, fearful that the weight might collapse without warning. In others, the walls lean precariously inward, forcing walkers to duck, their breath frosting against the cold white surface. The paths twist and bend, more like burrows than streets, each one a lifeline cut through the storm. Neighbors meet here in ways they never did when streets were open. Bundled in scarves and thick coats, they pause in the narrow corridors to exchange words, their voices hushed as though in a church. They ask after one another's health, share news of dwindling food, pass along warnings of families in need. A mother hands over a small bundle, 2 potatoes wrapped in cloth, to a neighbor whose children have eaten nothing since yesterday. Another man offers a scoop of coal, black dust staining his gloves, knowing the gift may cost him warmth in his own hearth. Children follow behind, their eyes wide, treating the tunnels like adventure. They trail their hands along the walls, press their ears to the snow, listening for the roar of the storm above. Their laughter, though brief, carries strangely in the confined space, echoing until it sounds almost like another group of children far off in the white. Parents hush them quickly, fearful of collapse, but the tunnels give the young a sense of wonder amid the fear. At night, lanterns left burning turn the tunnels into glowing arteries beneath the city. The flicker of light seeps through gaps in the snow, casting faint halos on the drifts above. From a distance, it looks as if the ground itself is alive with veins of fire. Families move carefully, carrying baskets, pulling sleds laden with scraps of food, jars of water, kindling scavenged from broken fences. Every journey is slow, every step measured, for to stumble here is to risk being buried if the walls give way. Still, the tunnels endure. They are not built of stone or wood, yet they serve as bridges of survival, connecting lives otherwise sealed behind walls of snow. In the heart of the blizzard, When streets are gone and silence reigns above, it is these narrow, hand-dug passageways that remind the people they are not alone. Tunnels between houses, carved with sweat and stubbornness, become the very arteries of the buried city. The storm punishes not only with snow and wind, but with something more insidious: the creeping sickness that slips into lungs and refuses to let go. In the cramped rooms of cabins and city tenements alike, the air grows heavy with smoke, damp wool, and human breath. Fires burn low, drafts sneak through walls, and in the silence between gusts of wind, you hear it, the cough, harsh, rattling, persistent, the cough of cold. It begins softly, a tickle at the throat, dismissed as nothing more than a chill. But in houses where damp has seeped through seams and walls groan under frost, the cough spreads quickly. Children are the first to weaken, their thin frames shaking beneath quilts, each breath shallow, each exhale clouding the cold air of the room. Mothers press cloths to their foreheads, whispering reassurances, though their own voices betray fear. Fathers pace, stirring the fire, feeding in the last sticks of wood, knowing warmth is the only medicine they can offer. In the city, physicians attempt to make rounds, lanterns swinging in the tunnels carved between houses, but their bags are light, their remedies few. Bottles of tincture freeze solid before they reach their patients. The doctors themselves cough as they work, scarves pulled high, eyes rimmed red from cold and exhaustion. They prescribe rest, warmth, broth, luxuries as scarce as flour or coal. For many, all that can be done is to endure. The sound of coughing fills the nights. Through thin walls, neighbors hear one another, each rasp echoing like a grim chorus. Some coughs are dry and hacking, others wet and rattling, heavy with fever. Babies wail until their throats are raw, then fall silent, exhausted. The storm drowns many noises, but it cannot silence this. The cough cuts through the roar of the wind, a reminder that even within the supposed safety of four walls, danger grows. In the countryside, isolation makes it worse. A single cabin buried to its roof cannot summon aid. Families improvise with poultices of onion, teas brewed from pine needles, warm stones pressed against aching chests. Some find relief, but others worsen, their coughs deepening into gasps that rack the body and leave it trembling. At night, prayers fill the air, pleas whispered into the dark for one more day, one more breath. The cough is more than illness, it is a thief of hope. Food may be rationed, fires tended carefully, but the sound of sickness reminds all that survival is not only about warmth and bread, it is about the frailty of the body itself, tested by cold that seeps deeper than the skin, gnawing into the lungs until even strong men stagger. By morning, some cabins are quieter, but not with health. Quilts are pulled higher over still forms, and neighbors digging new tunnels are met with silence when they knock. The cough has taken its toll, leaving grief to hang in the frozen air. And still, the storm rages outside, indifferent. The snow buries wagons and fences, the wind tears at roofs, but inside, it is the cough that rules. The cough of cold, sharp and merciless, echoing through the long nights of the blizzard, a sound more haunting than the silence itself. For as long as people could remember, the mail had been the thread that tied lives together. Letters carried across rails and rivers brought news of sons at sea, brothers on farms, fathers in distant cities. A knock at the door or the flap of the post slot meant connection, proof that no one was entirely alone. But when the blizzard came, that thread snapped. The mail was lost in white, scattered and buried like so many forgotten voices. The storm first halted the trains, freezing their wheels into drifts, and with them the mail cars heavy with sacks of letters. Whole bundles of words meant for waiting hands sat stranded in fields of snow, their inked promises locked inside frozen steel. Passengers shivered in one car, while next-door letters lay silent, messages of hope and worry sealed away by ice. Days passed, and those words grew colder, the chance of their delivery shrinking with every hour. In towns, post offices darkened, Clerks sat idle by stoves, tapping fingers on empty counters, the racks behind them bare. People arrived through tunnels carved in the snow, stamping frost from their boots, asking if word had come from sons in New York or daughters across the river. The clerks shook their heads, their breath fogging in the air, repeating the same answer: nothing today, nothing at all. The disappointment in the faces of those who turned away was deeper than hunger or cold. It was the ache of silence. Some families clung to letters already written, folded sheets resting on tables, ink long dried. They had been prepared before the storm, ready to send, filled with ordinary words of health, of business, of love. Now they sat undelivered, useless weights in pockets and drawers. To write another line felt meaningless when no messenger could carry it beyond the buried streets. For the first time in memory, voices had been trapped on paper, with no wings to carry them outward. Along the countryside, mail carriers who had once guided their horses through rain and mud found themselves halted completely. Sacks of letters froze to their saddles, leather stiff, paper curling with damp. Some abandoned their routes, turning back in defeat. Others pressed onward, dragging sleds through tunnels of snow, lanterns swinging, but most were swallowed by the storm before reaching their destination. Somewhere out in the white, letters lay scattered beneath drifts, ink bleeding into damp, names and places dissolving into nothing. The absence of mail weighed heavily. Lovers waiting for word began to fear the worst. Parents whose sons traveled on business imagined them lost without a trace. Soldiers on distant posts remained unaware of deaths or births at home, while merchants fretted over contracts and debts left unanswered. Rumors grew quickly in the silence, filling the gap where facts should have been. At night, families sat by their fires, staring at empty tables where letters should have lain. Children asked when the postman would return, and parents forced smiles, saying, soon, though their own hearts doubted. The blizzard had not only buried roads and rails, it had buried voices, dreams, and reassurances. The mail was lost in white, and with it, the comfort of knowing that someone, somewhere, still reached back through the storm. The river that once breathed life into the city now lay shackled, its surface bound in jagged plates of ice. The Hudson, restless and broad, had always carried ferries, steamers, and barges across its waters, connecting the bustling heart of Manhattan with the towns of New Jersey and the valleys beyond. But during the blizzard, the river froze, not with a gentle glaze, but with a brutal armor that turned its rolling current into a graveyard of motionless shards. Ice on the Hudson meant isolation. From the shoreline, you can see the ferries trapped mid-crossing, their hulls groaning against the tightening grip. Smoke rises weakly from their stacks, the engines straining, but the wheels churn uselessly against ice instead of water. Passengers press against frosted windows, watching in disbelief as the vessel that once carried them swiftly to safety now sits immovable, caught between two worlds with no path forward and no path back. Lanterns glow faintly on deck, swallowed by the storm, as crewmen swing axes at the encroaching floes, their blows dull and hopeless against the endless weight of winter. Dock workers stand helpless on the piers, ropes frozen stiff in their hands. They call across the ice, but the wind steals their voices. Barges laden with coal, flour, and supplies lie stranded in the channel, their cargo unreachable, the lifeblood of the city locked away beneath a frozen lid. Hunger grows sharper in homes as those supplies remain just out of reach, visible but untouchable. By day, the ice groans like a living creature, shifting and cracking under its own weight. Great slabs collide with thunderous echoes, piling over one another like fallen walls. By night, the river becomes a ghostly expanse, the moon casting pale light across ridges and crevices, each glint a cruel reminder of the waters hidden below. The sound of splitting ice carries into the city's streets, a deep, resonant boom that startles those lying awake in their beds, wondering if the river itself is breaking apart. For ferrymen, the frozen Hudson is ruin. Their proud vessels lie useless, their livelihoods swallowed by frost. Some pace the piers with lanterns, staring out across the white expanse as if sheer will might melt the ice. Others curse into the storm, their voices bitter against the silence. Commuters stranded on the Manhattan side sleep in offices and churches, while those on the far shore huddle in inns and barns, unable to reach their families. The river, once a bridge, has become a wall. Children peer from windows, marveling at the sight of men walking where boats once sailed. Brave souls venture onto the ice, their boots crunching, their shadows long under lantern light. But the Hudson is treacherous. Beneath the crust, the current still flows, tugging at weak places. More than one wanderer vanishes with a sudden crack, the ice sealing again before help can reach. Stories of these losses spread quickly, turning marvel into fear. By the storm's height, the Hudson lies utterly still, a frozen artery halting the pulse of commerce and kinship alike. No letters cross, no supplies arrive, no ferry whistles echo in the night. The city waits, cut off by a river turned to stone, the silence of its frozen surface, a reminder that even the mightiest waters can be bound by winter's hand. Ice on the Hudson is more than weather, it is a prison, holding the city captive in its shimmering, merciless grip. For generations, the ferries on the Hudson had been steady as clockwork, their whistles cut through fog and storm alike, carrying commuters, merchants, and families across the restless river. To stand at the dock in the early morning was to know with certainty that soon the familiar vessel would round the bend, its decks bright with lanterns, its paddles beating the water into froth. But during the blizzard of 1888, the ferry never came. You can imagine the waiting crowd that first morning, men stamping their boots on the pier, women clutching baskets, children tugging at their sleeves. The snow was already falling heavy, the wind sharp enough to sting the skin, but still they waited. Eyes scanned the white horizon, searching for the faint outline of a smokestack, for the dark shape of a hull pressing through the storm. Minutes stretched into an hour, but the water lay empty, the river already stiffening with ice. The ferry that should have appeared like clockwork was gone, swallowed by the storm. Some said it had been forced to turn back, trapped by floes too thick for its paddles. Others whispered darker stories, that it had frozen mid-channel, passengers still aboard, their lanterns flickering against the night as the hull was locked in ice. In truth, several ferries had tried to fight the storm, their crews swinging axes at the floes, engines straining, but the Hudson was merciless. Ice sealed around them, rudders froze stiff, and one by one they abandoned the effort. The ferry routes, the lifeline of the city, vanished beneath winter's grip. On the Manhattan side, commuters were stranded. Clerks who lived across the river could not return home, their families waiting in darkened houses with fires burning low. Fathers spent nights sleeping on benches in train stations or pews in churches, wrapped in coats that grew stiffer with frost. Mothers, waiting on the opposite shore, pressed their children close and whispered that he would return tomorrow, though tomorrow came and still the ferry did not arrive. The absence weighed heavily on commerce too. Barges of coal and flour remained stuck, their cargo useless as hunger and cold deepened in the city. Shopkeepers paced empty shelves, shaking their heads at customers who pleaded for goods. The ferry's absence was more than inconvenience, it was the severing of supply, the sudden collapse of a lifeline everyone had taken for granted. By evening, the piers grew deserted. The wind howled across them, filling footprints with drifts, leaving the docks ghostly and still. Lanterns left burning were soon smothered in snow, their flames extinguished. Only the creak of ice against wood broke the silence, as if the river itself were mocking those who had waited in vain. The storm raged for days, and each morning brought the same question: would the ferry come today? Each evening brought the same answer: no. The whistles that once marked the rhythm of life had fallen silent. Families remained divided, commerce frozen, and the city felt smaller, lonelier, as if the river had grown into an uncrossable ocean. The ferry that never came became more than a story of boats and ice. It was a symbol of the storm's power, of how quickly the ordinary can vanish, leaving only absence in its place. On those frozen days of March, the people of the Hudson learned what it meant to wait for something steady and faithful, only to discover that even the most reliable promises can be broken by the fury of winter. When the ferries froze in the Hudson and the trains ground to a halt in the drifts, Manhattan became a cage. Thousands who had crossed the river for work found themselves unable to return home, trapped on the island as the storm raged. At first, they lingered near the piers, stamping their feet for warmth, scanning the horizon for smoke or the dark outline of a hull. But as the hours passed and the snow deepened, the truth settled heavy. No ferry would come. They were stranded on Manhattan, cut off from family and home. The first night was the hardest. Men who had expected to be home by supper found themselves wandering streets that grew silent under the storm's weight. Some sought shelter in taverns, where the lamps still burned and fires crackled, though the beer grew thin and the food vanished quickly. Others drifted toward churches, their heavy doors opening to admit shivering crowds who lay across pews, coats pulled high against the cold. The great stone walls of the sanctuaries echoed with coughs, snores, and whispered prayers, the storm's voice pressing faintly through stained glass. Rail stations became dormitories. Clerks and laborers huddled together on benches, their breath fogging in the icy air, the smell of coal smoke mingling with damp wool. Conductors handed out what blankets they could find, thin scraps compared to the storm's bite. Outside, locomotives stood buried in drifts, their mighty wheels useless, their whistles silent. To those stranded, the sight of the frozen trains was a grim reminder there would be no leaving tonight, nor perhaps tomorrow. For those with a few coins left in their pockets, hotels offered refuge, though their rooms filled quickly. Grand lobbies once meant for elegance now overflowed with bodies, men lying shoulder to shoulder on marble floors, women huddled on stairwells, children curled beside luggage. Even the most refined establishments bent under the storm's demand, chandeliers casting pale light on crowds more desperate than dignified. The city's wealth could not outmatch the blizzard's reach. By the second day, hunger joined the cold. Markets had emptied, taverns had little to serve, and those stranded were forced to share what little they carried. A crust of bread passed carefully from hand to hand, an apple sliced into thin slivers, a flask of whiskey shared in whispers, all became treasures in the white silence. Conversations turned often to home, wives waiting by shuttered windows, children asking when father would return, farms and shops left untended across the river. The distance was not great, but the storm had made it impassable, and that short stretch of water became a gulf as wide as the sea. At night, lanterns glowed faintly in the tunnels of snow, lighting the paths of those still searching for shelter. But the island itself seemed subdued, muffled beneath drifts and silence. Manhattan, usually alive with noise and movement, had become a place of waiting, of men pacing floors, of women weeping quietly, of children asking questions that had no answers. The blizzard had turned the city into a prison, its walls made not of stone but of snow and ice. And within that prison, thousands sat stranded, hearts aching for the homes they could not reach, each hour stretching long in the white grip of the storm. The storm did not only bury, it broke. Under the crushing weight of snow and ice, the city groaned like a living thing. Rafters bent, beams cracked, and roofs that had stood for generations finally gave way. The sound of collapse became a dreadful chorus across those frozen days, echoing through alleys and fields alike, a reminder that nothing built by human hands could stand forever against winter's fury. It began with small things, sheds buckling under drifts, barns sagging until their doors warped. At first, the noises were muffled, mistaken for the groan of timbers in the wind. But soon came sharper sounds, the crack of splitting beams, the crash of falling boards, the dull thud of walls sinking into snow. Families huddled inside their cabins heard it with dread, each creak of the rafters a question: would their roof hold, or would they be next? In the city, the danger was even greater. Tenements with flat roofs collected snow in heavy slabs, each gust piling more upon them until the weight grew unbearable. Residents climbed stairwells with shovels, trying to clear the loads, but the storm erased their work as quickly as it was done. Some made it down safely, others did not. More than one building collapsed with men still on the roof, the snow swallowing both rescuer and home in an instant. Shops along the avenues fared no better. Storefront awnings tore away, their frames snapping under ice. Entire facades groaned and bowed, glass shattering outward in sudden explosions of sound. Merchants who had hidden inside, guarding what little food remained, fled into the tunnels of snow, clutching sacks and baskets, leaving behind the ruins of their livelihoods. In the countryside, barns fell like matchsticks. Farmers wept as roofs caved over stables, animals trapped beneath. The muffled cries of livestock mixed with the storm's howl, a sound that carried through the night to neighbors too far to help. Men dug with shovels, with bare hands, with desperate strength, but often they arrived only to find silence where once there had been life. For those trapped in cabins, the sound of collapse haunted every hour. The timbers above popped and groaned like gunshots in the dark, each one a warning. Families lay awake, staring upward at beams they had trusted all their lives, praying they would not give way. Children whispered questions, would the snow crush them? And parents pressed them close, answering with reassurances their own hearts could not believe. By the third day, the city sounded like a battlefield. Crashes echoed in the distance, followed by the hush of snow-smothering ruins. Each collapse left behind a jagged scar, a roof sunken, a wall broken, a home erased. Neighbors gathered around the wreckage, lanterns casting trembling light over the ruins, their breaths rising in clouds as they searched for survivors. Sometimes they found them pale and shivering, pulled free from the weight. Other times they found only stillness. The storm had already silenced voices, frozen rivers, and emptied markets. Now it tore down the very walls that sheltered the living. And as families sat by faint fires, listening to the night, it was not the wind they feared most. It was the sudden crack, the deafening crash, the terrible sound of collapse. Through the storm, when the streets vanished and the city fell silent, there remained one stubborn sentinel, the lamppost. Bent with ice, its iron ribs groaning beneath the storm's weight, it stood against the blizzard as if refusing to yield. The flame within its glass flickered, dim and trembling, but it burned still, casting a faint halo that turned the swirling snow into a blur of gold and white. To those who passed in the tunnels beneath the drifts, it was more than a lamp, it was a sign of life. The lonely lamppost marked what once had been a crossroads, a place where trolleys rattled and vendors cried their wares. Now the street was gone, buried in white walls higher than rooftops, but the lamp remained. Its post rose like a solitary mast from a sea of snow, the only familiar shape in a city made strange. Children, led by their parents through the trenches, pointed to it with wide eyes. "There," mothers whispered, "that is where we turn." It became compass and beacon, a fragile anchor in a world swallowed whole. The storm tried to silence it. Ice formed thick upon its glass, clouding the flame within. Gusts howled through the canyons of snow, battering the iron with shrieks that echoed like voices in pain. At times the flame shrank to a pinprick, threatening to vanish, yet each time it flared again, stubborn against the darkness. Passers-by paused beneath it, stamping their feet, taking comfort in its glow before moving on. In that brief circle of light, they felt less lost, less forgotten by the world. Some swore the lamp-post had a voice of its own. The wind bent around it in mournful tones, the glass rattling like a whisper, the flame pulsing with each gust. To the weary and the hungry, it seemed to breathe, to nod, to listen. Men leaned their hands upon its frozen shaft, whispering prayers or curses before trudging away. Women carrying baskets of scraps looked up at its glow as though seeking strength. Children lingered to watch the flakes dance in its light, their laughter fragile but real. When the nights grew deepest, the lamppost stood alone, its glow casting long shadows against the snow walls. Entire avenues stretched away in silence, the city hushed as though asleep beneath its white shroud. Yet the lamp still burned, a single star at ground level, holding back despair with its faint glow. To see it from afar, blurred through the storm, was to know you were still on a path, still tethered to something familiar, even as the blizzard tried to erase all memory of place. By the time the storm eased, many lamps had gone dark, their fuel spent, their glass shattered. But the lonely lamppost remained, its flame guttering but alive. It had endured nights of wind and collapse, hunger and fear, and still it burned. To those who survived the blizzard, its light was remembered not as brightness but as defiance. A single flame in a city buried, a sentinel in the storm, the lonely lamppost that refused to die. In the heart of the storm, when streets vanished and the world beyond the door was only white silence, life narrowed to the glow of the hearth. It was there that mothers kept vigil, their hands busy though their eyes betrayed their fear. Around the flickering fire, they became the steady heartbeats of their homes, feeding flames, rationing food, and drawing their families close. While the wind howled and roofs groaned, it was mothers at the hearth who kept the night from breaking entirely. The hearth itself became the axis of survival. Every scrap of wood was counted, every coal nudged carefully to last a little longer. Mothers bent low over the fire, coaxing sparks into flame, blowing softly until smoke gave way to embers and embers to heat. Their fingers, reddened from cold and cracked from labor, turned logs with practiced patience. They measured warmth not in comfort but in breaths, how many hours the fire could stretch, how many bodies it could keep alive until dawn. Children huddled nearby, quilt-wrapped bundles with wide, worried eyes. They looked to their mothers for reassurance, watching every movement, every whispered word. The storm pressed hard against the walls, shrieking through shutters, but a mother's voice could still soothe. She told stories in low tones, tales of summers filled with fields of green, of rivers that ran free instead of frozen. Her words painted pictures that filled the room with something larger than fear, giving the little ones a world beyond the storm's grip. Meals were humble but sacred. A potato sliced into thin rounds became stew when boiled with snowmelt. A crust of bread was softened in broth and passed carefully from hand to hand. Mothers stretched rations with quiet ingenuity, scraping the last flour into flat cakes, simmering onion skins to flavor water. They often ate the least, pushing their share toward children or the frail. Hunger gnawed at them too, but they bore it silently, as if sacrifice were as natural as tending the fire. Fathers worked as well, digging tunnels, clearing roofs, braving the storm for coal or kindling, but it was the mothers who guarded the hearth, the fragile center of warmth and hope. Their eyes flicked constantly between the flames and the faces gathered around them, calculating how to preserve both. They soothed coughing offspring with warm cloths, tucked blankets higher around shivering shoulders, and held vigil through the night, rising often to check the fire. Sleep was a luxury they denied themselves. Vigilance was their burden. The storm outside might have been endless, but within the small circle of the hearth, mothers forged a space of light. The glow painted their faces in amber, shadows stretching long on the walls, their silhouettes strong and steady against the blizzard's roar. Children fell asleep listening to their mother's humming, the sound mingling with the crackle of logs and the sigh of wind at the shutters. And so, while the city lay buried and trains froze on the rails, it was mothers at the hearth who held families together. Their labor was quiet, often unseen, but it was their hands that kept the flame alive, their voices that steadied hearts, their watchfulness that carried the household through the longest nights of the blizzard. It was not silence that defined the storm, but sound, an endless, unrelenting voice that filled every hour. The blizzard did not whisper. It roared, a beast pressing its mouth to every crack and chimney, howling into homes until it seemed the very walls were alive with noise. To lie awake during those nights was to hear the storm's fury as a constant chorus. The shriek of wind, the rattle of shutters, the groan of timbers, the hiss of snow hurled against glass. The blizzard's roar was everywhere, a sound that never ceased. When the gusts rose, they came like waves breaking on invisible shores. One moment the wind shrieked high and thin, like the cry of something wounded, and the next it dropped into a low, booming growl that shook rafters. Snow hurled itself sideways, slamming against windows with such force that families wondered if the panes would shatter. Roofs trembled under its weight, and with each gust came the fear that the next would be the one to tear everything apart. Inside the tunnels carved through drifts, the roar was magnified, echoing down the narrow corridors until the snow itself seemed to vibrate. Lantern flames quivered and sputtered in the gusts that snuck through, their glow shivering across the packed white walls. Travelers pressed close, heads bent, their voices swallowed as soon as they spoke. Even shouting to a neighbor only a few feet away became a futile effort. The storm answered every word with its own voice, drowning all human sound. For those stranded on trains or ships, the roar was even more merciless. Passengers huddled in silence, while outside the blizzard howled against the iron hulls, rattling every bolt, shaking the very frames. The wind shrieked through cracks in the walls, a sound like 1,000 whips cracking at once. Some tried to cover their ears, but the storm pressed through even that, its voice burrowing deep into the skull until it seemed to vibrate within the bones. At night, the roar grew more terrifying. In the dark, with lamps burning low and families huddled beneath quilts, the storm's voice became a constant reminder that the world outside had been erased. Children wept, covering their ears, while parents hushed them with soft words, though their own eyes betrayed unease. Sleep was shallow, broken by sudden crescendos when the wind struck like a hammer against the house, sending doors rattling and rafters groaning. Dreams dissolved into waking with every crash, every scream of air. Even in the rare lulls, the silence felt deceptive, a pause before another assault. People lay awake, counting breaths, waiting for the next gust. And always it came. Sometimes the storm screamed like a banshee, other times it growled low, like distant thunder rolling across frozen plains. But it never truly ceased. By the storm's height, people no longer spoke of snow or cold. They spoke of the sound, the roar that filled their ears, their homes, their hearts. It was the storm's true weapon, wearing down spirit as much as body, reminding all who listened that this was not simply weather, but a force alive, relentless, and merciless. The blizzard's roar was the anthem of their captivity, echoing over a city buried in white. When the storm howled loudest and the snow pressed high against the windows, families drew closer to the stove. Its glow was faint compared to the fury outside, but around it life continued in the only way it could, through stories. Tales by the stove became as necessary as bread and fire, weaving warmth into rooms that would otherwise have been consumed by fear. The stove glowed red in its seams, iron crackling as logs surrendered to flame. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces flushed with heat on one side, cold shadows on the other. They leaned against their mothers' knees or huddled beneath quilts, eyes wide as the stories began. Fathers, weary from shoveling snow or hauling water through tunnels, leaned on the wall or sat at the table, their rough hands wrapped around tin mugs of broth. In those hours, words became shelter, each tale another log laid on the fire of the spirit. Some stories were old, told by grandmothers whose voices rasped like the wind but carried wisdom steadier than the storm. They spoke of earlier winters, of nights when wolves howled at the edge of the village, of ancestors who crossed frozen rivers to build the homes now buried in snow. Their tales reminded the children that hardship was not new, that others had endured, and so would they. The rhythm of these stories was slow, measured, like embers glowing long after flames had dimmed. Other stories were lighter, spun by fathers with tired smiles who sought to keep fear at bay. They spoke of summers on green fields, of fishing trips where the river sparkled under the sun, of harvest days when the air smelled of apples and grain. Children giggled at tales of mischief, of horses that stole carrots, of brothers who fell headfirst into haystacks. These tales were sparks against the storm, flickers of laughter that rose above the blizzard's roar. And then there were the tales of wonder, whispered by mothers whose hands never stopped their work, mending, stirring, folding, while their voices painted magic across the darkened room. They told of giants that lived in mountains of snow, of lanterns that could guide lost souls through white deserts, of stars that sang when the world grew quiet. Their words softened the edges of fear, turning the storm outside into something less monstrous, more like a story itself, one that would eventually end. In these circles of firelight, the storm seemed to hesitate. The roar against the walls continued, but inside, another rhythm grew, a cadence of voices rising and falling, of listeners leaning closer, of silence filled not with dread but with wonder. For a few hours, the hunger in their bellies and the ache in their bones were forgotten, replaced by the steady warmth of story. When at last the children grew heavy-eyed and the flames burned low, the tales faded into murmured prayers and whispered goodnights. The stove sighed, embers pulsing faintly, as if it too listened. Outside, the blizzard raged on. But within those rooms, stories had built walls stronger than snow. Tales by the stove had carried them through another night. The storm's cruelty was not measured only in hunger or cold, but in silence when neighbors failed to answer a knock, when figures vanished into the white and never returned. By the height of the blizzard, the city and countryside alike began to reckon with its toll. Streets once filled with movement now held still shapes half buried in drifts, bodies claimed by frost and snow. The blizzard built its own graves, and the people called them coffins of ice. It began with those caught outside when the wind rose too quickly, drivers forced to abandon their wagons, workers who thought they could cross one more block before night fell, children sent on errands that should have taken minutes. They collapsed in doorways, on steps, in alleys where the snow buried them within hours. By morning, only faint mounds marked where they lay. Lantern light sometimes revealed a hand reaching upward, frozen mid-gesture, or the dark curve of a hat beneath the glaze of ice. These sights seared into memory, reminders of how swiftly life could vanish into white. On the rail lines, passengers who dared leave stranded trains sometimes became part of the storm's harvest. Thinking they could walk to the nearest town, they set out with scarves pulled high, lanterns clutched tight. But the wind smothered the light, the snow blinded their eyes, and their footsteps vanished within seconds. Days later, searchers found them only a few yards away, curled beneath drifts as if asleep, their stillness made permanent by the storm. In the countryside, farmers lost in their own fields met the same fate. Some tried to reach stables to tend to animals, others to cut paths to neighbors. They never returned. Families waiting inside heard nothing above the blizzard's roar. When the storm broke, they found their fathers or sons lying just beyond the cabin walls, stiffened by cold, their faces pale beneath a crust of frost. The snow itself became their coffin, sealing them in silence until Thor would return the earth to the living. Even animals shared this fate. Horses collapsed mid-stride, their sides steaming until the blizzard smothered the last warmth. Dogs sent to guide or fetch lost travelers were found days later, curled against fences, their bodies rimmed in ice. The storm showed no mercy, claiming beasts and men alike. For the living, the sight of these coffins of ice was unbearable. Children were pulled quickly away from windows when rescuers passed, carrying stiff forms wrapped in blankets. Churches became places not only of refuge but of mourning, their pews lined with the bodies of those brought in from the snow. Bells, once silent, tolled again not for worship but for death. At night, families whispered prayers for those already taken, and for themselves that they would not join them. The sound of the storm outside, the shrieking wind, the weight on the roof felt heavier knowing what lay beyond the walls. To step outside was to risk becoming another still figure, another mound in the snow. The blizzard buried not only streets and houses, but lives, one after another, until the land itself seemed a vast cemetery. Coffins of ice stretched from the Hudson's frozen banks to the farthest farms, a grim testament carved in white. And as the storm raged on, the living huddled closer to their fires, praying they would not be next. Snow and ice ruled the blizzard, but sometimes the cruelest enemy was fire. In homes where stoves burned too hot or lanterns tipped in the dark, flame met timber, and the storm turned protector into destroyer. Fire in the storm was unlike any other. It roared against the wind, a red defiance in a world of white, yet it devoured as mercilessly as the blizzard itself. It often began quietly. A coal spilled from a stove onto a rug. A lantern, shaken by the gusts that slipped through cracks in the walls, toppled to the floor. Curtains too close to the hearth caught a spark. In ordinary weather, neighbors would rush with buckets of water. Snow scooped hastily from yards, and the blaze could be stopped. But in the blizzard, with tunnels blocking movement and winds driving smoke sideways, a small flame could grow into disaster before help arrived. The snow outside made rescue cruelly difficult. Streets were impassable, and even when men shoveled furiously through the drifts, they often arrived too late. The storm itself seemed to mock their efforts. Gusts carried sparks upward, feeding them with oxygen, while the howling wind made the fire leap higher instead of smothering it. Red light flickered across the snow, casting eerie shadows along the white walls of tunnels. Families huddled in nearby houses watched helplessly as a neighbor's roof glowed, then collapsed, sparks swirling into the storm like a swarm of fireflies swallowed by the gale. For those trapped inside a burning home, the choice was unbearable. To remain meant smoke and flame. To flee meant stepping into the storm, blinded and half buried in snow. Some rushed out into the night with only quilts around their shoulders, stumbling through drifts as the heat of the fire gave way to the bite of the wind. Others tried to fight the blaze with buckets of snow, their hands blistering from heat and freezing from cold in the same desperate minutes. In the city, whole rows of buildings sometimes fell this way. Fire leapt from roof to roof, carried by the wind's hand, consuming structures even as snow piled on their steps. The storm should have been the fire's enemy, but instead the two forces twined together, one feeding chaos to the other. Firefighters who braved the tunnels dragged hoses through chest-high drifts, only to find pumps frozen, water solid in their lines. Their axes struck doors and beams, but the blaze moved faster than men could work. Lantern light blurred with firelight until the entire street glowed red through the white haze. By dawn, the fire always died, but not by human hands. It burned itself out against the storm, leaving blackened frames jutting from the snow like charred bones. Families returned to sift through ruins, finding only ash beneath the drifts, their possessions lost to flame even as winter held them prisoner. The blizzard was cruel enough in its cold, but fire made its cruelty sharper. In the storm, warmth turned treacherous, light turned deadly. Fire in the storm was not comfort, it was destruction, a reminder that survival meant balancing between two hungers, the white that froze and the red that burned. In every neighborhood buried by the storm, there was at least one figure who refused to yield, one who rose before dawn, wrapped himself in coat and scarf, and carried his shovel into the white. He was no soldier, no man of wealth or rank, but to those trapped behind snow walls, he became nothing less than a hero. With each stroke of his blade, he carved life back into a city smothered. They called him simply the man with the shovel. He began at his own door, digging a narrow trench through snow packed so tight it rang like stone beneath the iron. His breath came in clouds, freezing on his beard, hands blistered inside stiff gloves. Each step forward was a battle, each wall of snow a fortress. But he pressed on, widening the path until others could follow. Soon, doors opened behind him, neighbors leaning out with weary gratitude, lanterns casting faint halos into the trench. His work was endless. The blizzard did not rest, filling in what he had carved only hours before. Yet he fought the drifts as though each shovelful was an act of defiance. He dug paths to doorsteps where families had been sealed inside for days, air thick with smoke from half-choked chimneys. He cleared the way to barns where animals lowed weakly, trapped without feed. He tunneled toward the market square, knowing even an empty shop was better than no shop at all. Children followed at a distance, marveling at his strength, whispering that he must be stronger than the storm itself. They carried small shovels or buckets, mimicking his strokes, though their work was play. For them, the man with the shovel was proof that the snow could be beaten back, that the white walls were not eternal. Parents, too weary or too hungry to dig, offered him scraps of bread, a cup of broth, or the last potato from a dwindling basket. He never refused, but never asked. His work was not for pay, it was for survival, for all. At night, when lanterns flickered along the tunnels he had carved, his shadow stretched long against the walls, a dark figure moving tirelessly in the glow. Neighbors whispered stories of him, how he had saved a woman too weak to break her door free, how he had carried coal to an old couple who could not leave their bed, how he had dug for hours to uncover the body of a horse buried in snow, simply so it would not be forgotten beneath the drifts. The storm tried to undo his labor, but his shovel struck again and again, each blow a rhythm of endurance. To the families who walked the paths he carved, he was more than a man. He was proof that hands and will could still matter against the immensity of nature. When the blizzard finally eased, the first clear ways through the city bore the marks of his blade. People remembered the tunnels, the doorsteps uncovered, the faces freed from behind walls of snow. The storm had shown its power, but the man with the shovel had shown his. And in the silence that followed, when the city began to breathe again, he stood as a quiet hero, ordinary, nameless, but unforgettable. There came a night when time itself seemed to vanish, swallowed by the storm. The lamps burned low, the clocks ticked on, but no one could tell where dusk ended and dawn began. The sky and earth had joined into a single color, a white so deep and unbroken that it seemed the world had been erased. Families called it simply the night of endless white. From the windows of buried houses, no stars could be seen. No moonlight filtered through the storm. Instead, the snow glowed faintly, lit only by the reflection of distant lanterns or the dim pulse of a fire behind frosted glass. Outside, the drifts rose higher still, reshaping streets into winding valleys, bending fences until they disappeared, swallowing wagons and roofs alike. The air itself shimmered with flakes, each one caught in the endless dance of the gale. To step outside was to enter blindness, the world reduced to a swirl of white where up and down, near and far, lost all meaning. Inside, time stretched. Hours passed slowly, measured only by the need to tend the fire or add another blanket to shivering shoulders. Mothers hummed softly to their children, trying to lull them into sleep, though the roar of the wind shook the very timbers of the house. Fathers sat silent at the hearth, staring at the flames as though the fire alone held back eternity. Even the old, who had seen many winters, confessed later that this night was unlike any other, an eternity dressed in snow. The tunnels connecting one house to another grew treacherous. Lanterns sputtered, their flames fighting the drafts that clawed through the narrow passages. Snow sifted down constantly, filling the tracks of boots within minutes, threatening collapse with each gust. Yet some still braved the tunnels, carrying scraps of food or bits of coal to neighbors in need. Their figures vanished into the swirling white, reappearing only as faint shadows illuminated by the glow of a lamp. Each journey felt like walking into another world, where the storm was all and the only landmarks were the walls of snow themselves. On the rail lines, the stranded trains grew colder. Passengers huddled together for warmth, their breath clouding in the frigid air. Some whispered that dawn would never come, that the storm had frozen the world in place. Children whimpered in their mothers' arms, their cries fading into sleep that frightened the adults for its stillness. Lanterns dimmed one by one until the cars were filled with darkness, pierced only by the occasional spark of coal as it burned out. The night of endless white weighed heavily on the mind. Dreams and waking blurred together. Hunger and fear grew sharper in the silence between gusts. People wondered if the world had always been this way, if there had ever been green fields, or bustling markets, or sunlit rivers. It was as though memory itself had been covered, smothered beneath the storm's vast blanket. And yet, dawn did come, though it was hard to recognize. The storm eased not with brilliance, but with a softening of the wind, a faint grey light leaking into the drifts. Still, that night lingered in memory long after the night when the world turned white and endless, when time froze and survival meant clinging to one another in the storm's eternal grip. When the long night finally loosened its grip, people waited for the comfort of light. Dawn should have brought a clear horizon, a pale sun lifting over the frozen city, a promise that the worst was passing. But when the storm eased its howl, what arrived was not golden light or warmth, it was only another shade of grey. A dawn that brought no Sunday. You push open the door, expecting brightness, but the world outside is dim and colourless. The snow stretches in every direction, a flat expanse of white under a sky so heavy with cloud it seems only an arm's reach above your head. The storm no longer screams, but the silence it leaves behind is uncanny, pressing against your ears as though the world has been hollowed out. Shadows blur into the drifts, and the horizon has vanished completely. It is morning, yet the earth looks no different from the endless night before. Lanterns still burn in windows, their glow pale against the gloom. Families rise stiff from quilts, their faces lined with fatigue, blinking in disbelief that this is all the day offers. Children ask why the sun is gone, and parents answer with words of comfort they do not feel. The truth is plain, the storm has not ended, only shifted. The wind rests, but the sky remains sealed, the sun hidden behind its heavy veil. In the city, figures emerge into the trenches dug between drifts, moving slowly, shoulders hunched, their boots crunch in the packed snow, the sound startling in the quiet. No birds call, no wagons roll, no ferries whistle. Only the muffled footfalls of survivors mark the hour. They pause often, glancing upward, as if searching for the sun, hoping to see even a sliver of light break through. But the sky remains iron grey, indifferent to their longing. On the rail lines, passengers in stranded trains stir from restless sleep. They wipe frost from the windows, expecting dawn to reveal a path cleared, perhaps even a rescue on the horizon. Instead, they see only white plains under a sky that gives no hint of day. Their hope falters. Without the sun to measure time, hours blur, and despair deepens. Farmers, too, step cautiously from buried cabins, axes in hand, eyes scanning the sky. They test the air, sniffing for change, but the cold remains sharp, the clouds unbroken. Smoke rises weakly from chimneys, swallowed quickly into the low ceiling above. The fields, once full of crops and livestock, now resemble an Arctic wasteland, endless ridges and frozen mounds stretching farther than sight allows. The absence of the sun weighs on the spirit. Fire can warm the body, but light is what steadies the soul. Without it, the world feels unfinished, as if caught between night and day, unwilling to move forward. Mothers hush their children with stories of the sun's return. Fathers mutter that tomorrow will be clearer, but even their voices lack conviction. A dawn that brings no sun is no dawn at all. It is only a reminder of how fragile hope becomes in the grip of winter. And so the people wait, wrapped in grey light, their eyes searching the sky for a sun that does not come, clinging to the belief that eventually, somewhere beyond those clouds, it still exists. For as long as anyone could remember, the church bells had been the city's heartbeat. Their tones marked the hours, called the faithful to prayer, tolled for weddings and funerals alike. Even in storms, even in black nights, the bells always rang. But during the blizzard, when snow rose higher than rooftops and the world lay buried, the bells fell silent. The ropes were stiff with ice, the wheels locked, the tongues of bronze frozen fast. The church bells, once voices of iron certainty, were now mute against the storm. You can picture the steeple standing tall above the drifts, its spire coated in layers of frost, icicles hanging like teeth from its edges. Inside, the air is bitter, colder even than the streets outside. Snow has slipped in through cracks, dusting pews and altar alike. The great rope, once pulled by strong arms each morning, now hangs rigid, a frozen column stiff as stone. A sexton tugs at it, his gloves stiff with frost, but the rope does not yield. The bell above, encased in ice, groans faintly but does not move. The silence spreads quickly. Families who would normally count the hours by those deep, rolling notes find themselves lost in time. Dawn comes and goes without announcement. Evening falls without warning. In tenements and cabins alike, people look up suddenly, realizing they do not know what hour it island. The absence of the bells makes the storm feel heavier, as if time itself has been smothered beneath the snow. For some, the silence is unbearable. Old women whisper prayers, saying that without the bells, God has turned his face away. Children, confused, ask why the steeple is so quiet, and mothers tell them the bells are merely sleeping, waiting for the storm to pass. But even they look uneasily toward the sky, wondering if the bells will ever sound again. At night, the frozen bells loom like ghosts above the city. Lanterns glow faintly in the tunnels below, their light reaching only to the base of the steeple. From within, the silence presses down, broken only by the moan of wind through the rafters. Some say they can hear the bell faintly groan when the gusts strike just right, a sound like a sigh from iron lungs too cold to breathe. Others claim that the silence itself tolls in their minds, a phantom echo of what should have been. In the countryside, smaller churches fare no better. Wooden towers collapse under the snow, their bells tumbling into drifts, buried until spring. Farmers dig paths past the ruins, pausing only to bow their heads. Without the bells, Sundays pass like any other day of the storm, time reduced to hunger and cold, fire and silence. The sacred rhythm of life, ringing for birth, for death, for worship, vanishes into white stillness. The frozen bells become a symbol of the blizzard's dominion. Where even faith's voice is stilled, what hope remains? And yet, deep in their silence, there lingers a promise. For when the thaw comes, when ice melts and ropes loosen, the bells will ring again. Their voices will return to tell the city it has survived. But for now, they remain silent monuments, the church bells frozen, tolling only in memory. Before the storm, schools had been the heartbeats of neighborhoods, brick buildings warmed by the sound of recitations, chalk tapping against slate, and the chorus of children's laughter spilling into the streets. Even in winter, their windows glowed, fires burning in their stoves while lessons filled the rooms. But during the blizzard, those voices vanished. The halls grew cold, the desks empty, and the schools, once vibrant with noise, became tombs of silence. You can picture the building, half buried in snow, its doors blocked by drifts that rise higher than the windowsills. Icicles hang like daggers from the eaves, and the flagpole stands frozen stiff, its banner locked in ice. Inside, the blackboards are still marked with chalk from lessons abandoned days earlier, sums unfinished, maps half-drawn, words scrawled in childish script. The air is colder now than the outdoors, the stoves long extinguished, the ink in inkwells frozen solid. Teachers, stranded in their homes, sit by their own fires and think of their pupils. They imagine the rows of desks, the faces turned upward in attention, the rhythm of daily order. Without schools, days stretched differently for families. Children no longer march off with satchels or slates, their boots clattering on the cobblestones. Instead, they remain indoors, restless under quilts, their lessons reduced to the simple survival tasks of carrying wood, melting snow for water, or helping their mothers stir thin soup over the fire. The silence of schools is felt most keenly in the neighborhoods around them. Streets, once alive with shouts at recess, are now empty. filled only with the moan of wind through tunnels of snow. Neighbors passing by pause at the sight of the shuttered buildings, their outlines ghostly beneath white drifts. Some shake their heads and mutter prayers, for the absence of children's laughter feels like an omen, as though the blizzard has smothered the very future. For the children themselves, the storm reshapes their world. Some play in the tunnels carved between houses, their laughter brief and hushed by the storm, but most sit by the hearth, staring at books closed too long. Their minds wander restlessly, asking questions their parents cannot answer. When will the storm end? When can they return to their desks, their friends, their games? Stories by the stove become lessons, and mothers' voices take the place of teachers. But the rhythm is not the same. The structure of learning, the comfort of routine, has been broken. In the countryside, the loss is sharper still. One-room schoolhouses, often the only gathering place for miles, are sealed beneath drifts. The small bells above their doors hang silent, their ropes frozen stiff, just as the great church bells in the cities had fallen mute. Farmers trudge past, their children in tow, pointing to the buried buildings with quiet promises that they will return when the thaw comes. Until then, learning is left to memory and to hope. The schools without voices stand as monuments to the storm's reach. It is not only the present, it steals the bread, the fire, the warmth, but the future too, silencing the lessons meant to carry children forward. Their windows remain dark, their halls echo only with wind, and in that stillness the city feels older, lonelier, waiting for the day when laughter and recitation will once again chase away the silence. When at last the winds began to soften and the endless snow ceased its furious fall, the true weight of the storm revealed itself. For days people had lived in blindness, seeing only the walls of white around their doors, hearing only the roar of the blizzard beyond their windows. Now, as the air cleared and the grey sky lifted, they stepped into a world transformed, beautiful at first glance, cruel at second. The blizzard's toll was written everywhere. The streets were unrecognizable. Drifts higher than men stood like frozen battlements, stretching from block to block. Wagons, fences, and even houses were swallowed whole, their outlines visible only as lumps beneath the snow. Lantern posts leaned at odd angles, their glass shattered, their iron frames bent by ice. Telegraph poles lay toppled, wires trailing like severed veins across the frozen ground. Where once life had surged markets, ferries, trolleys, there was now only silence. And then came the count of lives. Families ventured out, moving through tunnels carved by weary neighbors, calling names into the still air. Some doors opened to reveal faces, weary but alive, bundled in quilts and smoke-stained from fires that had nearly failed. Others did not open at all. Inside those homes, fires had gone out, food had run dry, sickness had taken hold. In the city, bodies were carried through the tunnels on sleds, wrapped in blankets stiff with frost. In the countryside, farmers unearthed the still forms of neighbors in fields, found only when the snow relented enough to show where they had fallen. Animals lay buried too, their bodies discovered as drifts melted down. Horses, once strong enough to haul carts through mud and rain, were frozen in the streets, their outlines half submerged, eyes glazed with ice. Dogs and cattle, trapped in barns where roofs collapsed, were mourned nearly as deeply as kin, for they had been companions in survival, providers of food and labor. The storm had shown no mercy to man or beast. The toll was measured not only in death, but in loss. Families returned to shops burned by fires the storm had fanned, their goods reduced to ash beneath snow. Farmers found their seed corn ruined, their stores of grain damp and molding. Merchants calculated debts with empty ledgers, while mothers counted the last potatoes left in their baskets. Hunger still stalked the survivors, for the storm had not only killed but cut the supply lines that fed the city. Churches tolled their bells again when ice loosened their ropes, the sound rolling across the buried streets like a dirge. Funerals were hurried, graves dug shallow in the frozen ground, bodies lowered quickly before snow reclaimed the holes. Yet amid the mourning, there were also moments of quiet gratitude, neighbors clasping hands in relief when they discovered one another alive, families reunited after days of silence, small children laughing at the sight of sunlight glittering on the snow. Still, the cost could not be denied. The blizzard had claimed hundreds of lives, countless animals, and months of labor. It had left behind a city broken and a countryside scarred, its people humbled by nature's hand. The blizzard's toll was more than numbers. It was grief carved into every street, every family, every memory of those endless days of white. And though the storm had passed, its mark would endure, whispered in stories for generations yet to come. As the storm's fury began to loosen its hold, the city revealed its most haunting truth. The streets, once bustling with markets and carriages, had become avenues of death. Beneath the drifts, silent and still, lay those who had not made it home. The snow, falling without mercy, had entombed them where they fell, smoothing over their bodies until only faint mounds remained. To walk through the city after the blizzard was to tread streets of white graves. Neighbors searching for the missing carried lanterns, their light glimmering faintly along walls of snow. They dug with shovels, sometimes with bare hands, pulling at the drifts where a mitten or a hat brim showed through. More often, there was nothing to see at all, only intuition or the memory of a last known path guiding their efforts. When at last a frozen form was uncovered, silence always followed. The storm had left its mark too thoroughly, freezing features into stillness, stiffening limbs in final gestures of struggle. In some places, entire families were found together, their doorways blocked before they could escape. In others, solitary figures lay sprawled near tunnels, within sight of their own homes. Horses, too, lay beneath the snow, their harnesses still fastened, their bodies frozen mid-step. The storm had blurred all distinctions, rich or poor, man or beast, burying them alike beneath its endless shroud. Children peering from windows were quickly pulled away when such discoveries occurred. Parents whispered prayers, clutching them tightly, unwilling for their young eyes to see the cost of the storm. Yet even hidden, they knew. The silence of neighbors' doors, the absence of familiar voices, the mournful toll of church bells now freed from ice, all told the truth that the city had become a place of mourning. Funerals were hurried, for the ground was too hard to dig deeply. Graves were shallow, carved with pickaxes into earth still frozen stiff. Coffins were few, so bodies were wrapped in quilts or cloaks, lowered into the ground with what dignity could be mustered. Priests and pastors stood with numb hands, their voices trembling as they offered prayers over the dead. Snowflakes fell even then, soft and steady, covering the mourners' shoulders as if the storm itself sought to reclaim what it had given. In the countryside, the scene was the same. White fields hid their graves until thaw revealed them in spring. Farmers found neighbors where they had fallen in their own yards, paths unfinished between house and barn. Families marked the places with wooden crosses driven into the snow, makeshift headstones against the vast, empty plain. The survivors walked these streets with bowed heads, speaking softly, as if afraid to disturb the silence of the dead. Every mound in the snow became a reminder, every unmarked drift a possible grave. The city itself felt like one vast cemetery, its avenues no longer thoroughfares but corridors of mourning. The blizzard had stripped away the noise of life and replaced it with this terrible stillness. Streets of white graves stretched in every direction, a frozen ledger of loss, written not in ink, but in snow. And those who lived to see the thaw would never forget the sight, nor the silence, of walking among the buried. When the winds finally calmed and the skies ceased their endless snow, another trial began. The storm had buried the city in silence, but in its wake it left an emptiness more cruel than the blizzard itself, hunger. The cupboards were bare, the markets stripped, and the supply lines cut. Families who had endured the white fury now faced the slow, gnawing ache of emptiness in their bellies. Hunger in the aftermath became the shadow that lingered long after the snow had ceased to fall. In city streets, neighbors opened their doors cautiously, climbing out through tunnels to find shops shuttered, their shelves swept clean days before. Bakers had nothing left to sell but scraps of hardened dough, butchers' hooks hung bare, the last meat long since rationed. Milkmen's cans were empty, their roots abandoned. People carried baskets through the trenches, hoping against hope to find some overlooked stall, but they returned home with nothing. The few who had saved small stores of flour or beans guarded them carefully, stretching meals with melted snow and the thinnest broth. Children suffered most visibly. Their faces, once flushed with play, grew pale, their eyes large above hollowed cheeks. Mothers spooned out what little they had, pressing morsels into small hands and pretending they were full themselves. Fathers went without, their stomachs aching as they split the last potato into thin slices, boiled and shared among many. Hunger tightened its grip not in sudden violence but in slow persistence, a thief stealing strength hour by hour. In the countryside, barns and storehouses offered little relief. Feed for animals had dwindled during the storm, and many livestock lay weak or dead. Farmers cracked the ice from their cellars to uncover dwindling sacks of grain, only to find them damp and molding. Chickens had stopped laying, cows too weak to stand produced no milk. Families boiled whatever they could, frozen turnips dug from beneath snow, crusts softened in water, broth flavored with nothing more than bones. Neighbors leaned on one another, sharing what little remained. One house with flour baked small loaves and passed them to others, while another with beans boiled a pot that fed more mouths than their own. Yet generosity could not replace what had been lost. Hunger pressed even the kindest spirits into hard decisions. Some bartered away tools or quilts for a few ounces of grain. Others sold family heirlooms for food that would not last the week. The city's leaders scrambled to respond. Relief wagons struggled through half-cleared streets, their loads of bread and coal snatched eagerly by waiting crowds. Fights broke out in lines when supplies ran short. Soldiers were sometimes called to keep order, their bayonets gleaming above the bowed heads of the desperate. Even so, there was never enough. At night, homes grew quiet, not from rest but from weakness. Fires flickered low as families lay together, stomachs hollow, whispering promises that tomorrow would be better. The storm had passed, but the hunger it left behind was a storm of its own, slower, quieter, yet no less deadly. In the aftermath, the people learned that survival was not only about enduring the blizzard's roar, but also about enduring the silence that followed, when empty bowls and aching bellies spoke louder than the wind. Hunger was the storm's final cruelty, and for many, it was the hardest to bear. When the last winds died down and the sky finally lifted its grey shroud, the work of survival shifted. The storm had passed, but the city it left behind was unrecognizable. Drifts towered higher than roofs, streets lay blocked, and wreckage stood half buried in snow and ice. Rebuilding the city became the task of every hand, from the strongest laborer to the youngest child carrying pails of snow. It was not a single effort, but a chorus of shovels, axes, and willpower against the vast white ruins. The first task was to clear the streets. Men took up shovels and picks, some provided by the city, others pulled from barns and workshops. They dug day after day, carving broad trenches through walls of snow, their breath fogging in the cold air. Horses, what few had survived, were harnessed to sledges that hauled the piles away, hooves clattering faintly on cobblestones that reappeared beneath the ice. Teams worked until their arms shook, pausing only to warm themselves by fires built at corners where barrels burned, their smoke curling into the pale sky. From the drifts emerged the buried. Wagons, toppled fences, and shuttered shop fronts came into view, bent and broken by the storm's weight. Families clawed their way to the upper windows of their homes, digging downward to free the lower floors. In some cases, entire houses had been sealed beneath snow. Their inhabitants, alive but trapped, were rescued by neighbors who cut tunnels to their doors. Each successful uncovering brought cheers, weary but real. The markets returned slowly. Merchants swept snow from their thresholds and propped their doors open once more, though their shelves were bare. Supplies trickled in only after roads and rails were cleared, wagons groaning with loads of flour, coal, and salt pork. Crowds gathered eagerly, lines snaking through half-cleared streets, their coins clinking as they waited for goods that disappeared almost as soon as they arrived. It was not plenty, but it was the beginning of life returning to order. Churches rang their bells again, no longer frozen, their notes echoing across the city with tones of relief. Services turned into gatherings of gratitude and mourning, names read aloud of those lost, prayers offered for those who endured. Schools reopened their doors as well, desks dusted off, chalkboards cleared of lessons left unfinished weeks before. Children returned with slates under their arms, their laughter at recess piercing the heavy silence that had lingered too long. The city's wounds remained visible. Blackened shells of houses that burned during the storm stood stark against the snow. Telegraph wires still lay tangled, their posts snapped like twigs. Bridges needed repair, ferries to be freed from ice. But with each passing day, more smoke rose from chimneys, more lamps glowed in windows, more footsteps echoed in the streets. The people, hardened by days of hunger and nights of fear, bent themselves to the work without complaint. Rebuilding was not swift, but it was steady. Every shovel of snow tossed aside, every plank nailed back into place, was proof that the city was not lost. The blizzard had silenced it, buried it, nearly broken it. Yet from that stillness, voices returned, rising louder with each day of labor. The city would live again, not as it was, but as a place forever marked by the storm, rebuilt from both timber and memory. When the blizzard at last loosened its grip, the survivors stepped into a world that seemed both ruined and reborn. Everywhere, the storm had left scars, streets buried, homes broken, families grieving. Yet in that devastation, it also carved lessons, written not in ink but in ice. These lessons in the snow were remembered long after the drifts melted, shaping how people lived and how cities prepared for storms yet to come. The first lesson was the fragility of life. Families who once thought themselves secure discovered how quickly nature could humble them. Warm houses, full cupboards, strong horses all proved weak before wind and cold. The blizzard showed that safety was never certain, that survival could depend on the smallest things: a neighbor's shovel, a shared loaf of bread, a lantern held high in the storm. It taught gratitude, too, for the simplest of blessings: a fire that did not go out, a roof that did not fall, a voice that answered through the white silence. The second lesson was the need for preparation. In the weeks after, people spoke of the changes the storm demanded. The city resolved to bury telegraph wires underground, safe from the weight of ice. Plans were drawn for new systems of transport: subways that would not freeze, elevated tracks less vulnerable to snow. Families vowed never again to let their pantries grow thin in winter, laying aside extra sacks of flour, beans, and coal. Farmers strengthened their barns, merchants braced their shops, and whole communities looked upon the storm as a teacher, stern but undeniable. Another lesson lay in the power of community. The blizzard revealed how survival depended less on wealth or strength than on neighbors who refused to let one another fall. Tunnels dug between houses were remembered not only as paths through snow but as bridges between hearts. Strangers who had once passed without greeting now shared food, warmth, and labor. The storm reminded all that in times of trial, no one stood alone. It bound together city and countryside, rich and poor, in a shared memory of struggle. Children, too, carried lessons of the snow. They remembered the nights huddled close to the stove, listening to tales spun to chase away fear. They remembered seeing their parents sacrifice, their mothers eating less so they could eat more, their fathers digging paths through drifts long after exhaustion set in. These memories, etched deep, became stories told to their own children, warnings of what nature could do, and reminders of how people endured. And perhaps the greatest lesson was humility. The storm reminded even the proudest city that nature cannot be tamed. Progress, iron rails, ferries, and towers all bowed before snow and wind. Yet in that same humility lay strength, the recognition that survival depended on respect for forces larger than oneself. The storm demanded reverence, patience, and resilience, lessons as old as humanity itself, renewed in every generation. As spring finally touched the land, melting the last white walls, the people carried those lessons forward. They saw not only the destruction left behind, but also the endurance it had drawn from them. The blizzard had been merciless, but in its aftermath it left a kind of knowledge written deep in memory. Lessons in the snow, harsh, costly, unforgettable, became part of the story of the city itself. When at last the streets were cleared, the ferries freed, and the rails uncovered, the blizzard passed into memory, but it never truly left. Those who lived through it carried the scars in their bodies, in their homes, and in their hearts. They called it many names: the Great Blizzard, the Storm of March. But most often, they remembered it as the White Hurricane. For it had struck like no ordinary storm. It had swept across the land with the power of a sea tempest, burying towns as though they were ships on a frozen ocean. Years later, survivors still spoke of the silence, of the tunnels carved between houses, of the nights when the wind roared so fiercely it seemed alive. Children who had once sat wide-eyed by the stove grew into parents who retold the tales to their own families. They remembered the hunger, the cough that rattled through homes, the way church bells froze in their towers. And always they remembered the still forms uncovered in the thaw, neighbors lost in drifts, their final resting places marked only by snow. The memory was not only grief, it was also a story of endurance. People spoke of mothers who kept the hearth alive when wood grew scarce, fathers who dug through drifts until their hands bled, neighbors who carried lanterns into the storm to rescue strangers. They recalled the man with the shovel, the milkman's burden, the faint glow of a lonely lamp post. These figures became almost legendary, symbols of how ordinary people had risen against extraordinary odds. The White Hurricane left marks upon the city itself. Out of its destruction came change: telegraph wires buried underground, railways reimagined, and the first serious plans for subways that would not freeze beneath drifts. Laws were written to ensure greater stores of coal, greater readiness in markets. Architects spoke of roofs built to withstand heavy snow, of chimneys braced against the weight. The storm had taken much, but it had also forced resilience into the bones of the city. Still, no invention or progress could erase the memory. On cold nights, when the wind moaned through alleyways and snow began to fall heavy, old men would pause, staring out their windows with eyes clouded not by age alone. They would mutter of March 1888, warning the young that storms could come like thieves in the night, stealing warmth, light, and even voices. Children listened, wide-eyed, scarcely believing such a storm had once buried whole trains, silenced whole streets, and left behind what they called streets of white graves. In spring, when flowers returned and rivers thawed, the blizzard story did not fade. It lived on in sermons and in songs, in newspaper accounts and in hushed recollections shared over hearth fires. It became part of the land's identity, a reminder of how fragile and how strong people could be. The White Hurricane was not merely weather, it was a trial, a judgment, and a memory carved deep into the hearts of those who endured it. And so, long after the last drifts melted, the memory remained, lingering like frost upon the spirit. A reminder that nature could rise without warning, fierce and unrelenting, and that only together could humanity face it. The great blizzard of 1888 would never be forgotten, for it was more than a storm, it was a white hurricane that had swallowed a city, tested its people, and left behind a story as enduring as the snow itself.